There is a man standing outside a house. It is night. The dark comes in off the water and settles over everything like a second skin, the way it does on small islands where the sea is never more than a few minutes' walk in any direction. The man is wearing rags. His beard is long and matted with salt. His hands are empty. From inside the house, there is firelight. There is the sound of men laughing. Wine being poured. Someone playing an instrument badly and not caring. The sounds of men who have made themselves at home in a place that is not theirs. The man outside stands at the gate and listens. He has been standing there long enough that you start to wonder why he has not walked in. The gate is not locked. The door is not barred. There is nothing between this man and the warmth of that fire, except the length of a courtyard and whatever is happening inside his own chest. Then you find out who he is. This is his house. He is the king of this island. He built that gate with his own hands 20 years ago, before a war that was not his war came and pulled him away from everything he had built. He survived 10 years of the bloodiest fighting the ancient world had ever seen. He survived giants and witches and a goddess who offered him a life that would never end. He survived shipwrecks and sea monsters and the specific personal anger of a god who spent a decade trying to drown him. He crossed the whole known world to get back to this gate, and now he is standing outside it, in the dark, in the rags of a beggar, listening to other men drink his wine. He cannot walk through. Something happened to this man in those 20 years. Winning the war did not fix it. Surviving the ocean did not fix it. Making it back to this island did not fix it. He came home, and home had become the most dangerous place left in the world. This is the story of how he became the man at the gate. It starts 20 years before this night, on this same island, with a bed. The bed was built from a living tree. Odysseus had found the olive tree growing in the center of the courtyard, old and thick-trunked. Its roots sunk so deep into the rock of the island that nothing short of tearing the whole hill apart could move it. He built the bedroom around the tree, used the trunk as one of the bedposts, carved the frame from the branches, fitted the whole thing together with his own hands over the course of a summer. When he was done, the bed was anchored to the earth itself. It could not be moved, could not be carried out, could not be taken apart without destroying it. Only 2 people in the world knew this: Odysseus and Penelope. That bed, and the secret of it, is where this story ends. But we are not there yet. We are at the beginning, when Ithaca was still just home. Ithaca was not a grand island. It was small and rocky, more useful for goats than for farming. Stuck out in the Ionian Sea without the natural harbors or fertile plains that made other kingdoms wealthy. Other Greek kings ruled cities with high walls and storerooms full of grain. Odysseus ruled a rock with good fishing and people who had learned to be stubborn because the land gave them no other choice. He loved it completely. There is something worth understanding about Odysseus before the war, before the ocean, before all of it. The world he lived in had a very clear idea of what made a man great. Greatness meant standing in the front line when the spears started flying. Greatness meant the kind of strength you could see from a distance. Greatness meant being willing to die in a way that people would still be talking about 100 years later. Odysseus was not built for that kind of greatness, and he knew it. He was the kind of man who walked into a room full of hostile people and walked out with what he came for. The kind of man who could see 3 moves ahead when everyone else was still reacting to the first one. The kind of man who could talk his way through a door that a stronger man would have tried to break down. In the world of Greek heroes, that made him something between invaluable and deeply unsettling. Depending on who you asked, what he wanted was not glory. What he wanted was right here on this rock. Penelope had come from Sparta, which produced a very particular kind of person. She was sharp in the way that people become sharp when they have been underestimated for a long time and have learned to use that underestimation as a tool. She watched things. She thought before she spoke. She had a patience that most people mistook for passivity until it was too late. Odysseus recognized her immediately. She was the only other person he had ever met who played the long game. Their son Telemachus had been born just before everything fell apart. An infant, still nursing, not yet old enough to focus his eyes properly on his father's face. Odysseus had held him the way men hold new things they are afraid of breaking. Understanding that this small, warm weight was the best argument he had ever encountered for staying alive, the island, the woman, the child, the bed with its roots in the earth, this was what Odysseus had. Then a message came from the mainland, and the world he had built began to come apart. The story of how the Trojan War started is a story about a promise made by young men who did not understand what they were promising. Years before the war, when the most beautiful woman in Greece was choosing a husband, her father forced every man who wanted her to swear an oath. The oath said that whoever she chose, the rest of them would defend that marriage against anyone who threatened it. They all swore. They all wanted her. They thought it was the kind of oath that would never be called in. Her name was Helen. She chose Menelaus, king of Sparta. Then a Trojan prince named Paris came to visit and sailed home with Helen on his ship. And suddenly, every man who had sworn that oath received a message. The oath is being called in. We are going to Troy. We are going to get her back. Odysseus did not want to go. He was home, on his rock, with his wife and his infant son, and his bed with roots in the earth. He had everything he wanted. The war was Menelaus's problem, and Agamemnon's ambition, and the consequence of an oath that Odysseus had made when he was young and had not thought through carefully enough. And he was not interested, so he tried to get out of it. The recruiters arrived on Ithaca and found Odysseus in a field, plowing. He was using a donkey and an ox yoked together, which is not how you plow a field. And he was sowing salt into the ground instead of seed. A man who had lost his mind could not be held to an oath. A man who had lost his mind could not be made to fight a war. It was, by every measure, a brilliant plan. Then one of the recruiters, a man named Palamedes, picked up the infant Telemachus from Penelope's arms and placed the baby in the path of the plow. Odysseus stopped. He stopped because he could not let the blade touch his son. That reflex was faster than every calculation he had ever made. He stopped the plow, and he looked up, and the recruiters were watching him with the flat expressions of men who had just won. He was not mad. He had never been mad. Everyone knew it now. He had to go. The night before the ships left, he walked through the house slowly, touching things, the walls, the table, the room where Telemachus slept, too young to understand that his father was standing in the doorway, trying to do the math on whether the numbers came out to something survivable. Then he went to the bedroom. He put his hand on the bedpost, the one that was also a tree, the one whose roots went down into the rock of the island. It was solid. It was not going anywhere. He stood there for a long time. In the morning, he went to the harbor. He stood on the deck of his ship and watched Ithaca get smaller until it was a shape on the water, then a color, then nothing. Penelope was on the shore. He could not see her face anymore by the time the island disappeared, but he knew what she was doing. She was watching him the same way she watched everything, with that patience that people mistook for passivity, storing away everything she saw for later. She was going to need it. Odysseus arrived at Troy and understood immediately that this war was going to take a very long time. Troy was not a city you could take by force. It sat on a hill above the Aegean coast, behind walls that had been built to last forever, and very nearly had. The Greeks made camp on the beach below, pulled their ships up onto the sand, and began what would become 10 years of siege warfare. Two armies staring at each other across a field while people died slowly, and nothing changed. The Greek force was enormous. Ships from every corner of the Aegean had answered Agamemnon's call. Kings and princes and warriors who had all made that same oath. all of them now sitting in tents on a beach in a foreign country, waiting for something to break. Agamemnon commanded the whole expedition by virtue of being the most powerful king and the loudest voice in any room. Achilles was there, the greatest fighter any of them had ever seen. A man who moved through battle the way fire moved through dry grass. Ajax, Diomedes, Nestor, Menelaus himself, whose wife this whole war was theoretically about, and Odysseus, who had tried to plow a field with salt to avoid coming, who was now here anyway because of a baby, and a moment of instinct he could not take back. He made himself useful in the ways he knew how. When negotiations needed to happen, Odysseus went into Troy and talked. When the Greeks needed information about what the Trojans were planning, he went back in disguise, and listened when morale collapsed, which it did regularly over 10 years. He went tent to tent and reminded men why they were there, not because he believed every word he said, but because an army that stopped believing in itself stopped functioning, and a non-functioning army was going to get him killed before he ever saw Ithaca again. He was indispensable. He was also, in the way that clever people often were, among people who valued strength above everything else, not entirely trusted. There was a man named Palamedes, the same man who had put Telemachus in front of the plow on Ithaca. He had joined the expedition himself, and he was smart, genuinely smart, the kind of man who invented things and solved problems and was not quiet about either of those facts. He and Odysseus occupied a similar space in the Greek camp, the space of men valued for their minds rather than their spears, and that space was not large enough for both of them comfortably. In the traditions outside Homer, the story grows darker here. The later Greeks remembered it this way. Odysseus forged a letter that made it look like Palamedes had been taking bribes from the Trojans. He planted gold in Palamedes's tent. He constructed the evidence carefully, the way a man constructs anything when he has decided on the outcome and is working backward from it. Palamedes was tried and executed. Odysseus had made it happen. The man who had outsmarted him on Ithaca, who had put his infant son in front of a plow blade, was dead because Odysseus had decided that was the appropriate response to being outsmarted. He carried that the rest of his life. 9 years passed. 9 years of raids and skirmishes and men dying in amounts that would have seemed catastrophic before this war started and had become routine by now. The Trojans would not come out from behind their walls and fight a decisive battle. The Greeks could not break through those walls. The stalemate had become its own ecosystem, with its own rhythms and losses and small tragedies that nobody outside the camp would ever hear about. Then Achilles died, an arrow, guided by Apollo, shot by Paris from the walls. The greatest fighter in the Greek world went down not in single combat with an equal, but from a distance, by a man most of the Greeks did not consider a serious warrior. Hit in the one place on his body that could be hurt. Men who had watched Achilles fight and genuinely believed he was something more than human sat in the dark and said very little. Odysseus said nothing. He went to his tent and thought. He thought for a long time. Then he told Agamemnon he had an idea. The horse was his. The concept, the design, the specific dangerous idea at its center. He had a builder named Epius construct it from fir wood, hollow, large enough to hold around 20 men in absolute darkness and silence, built on wheels so the Trojans could move it. The plan was simple, in the way that only the most audacious plans were simple. Burn the camp, sail the fleet away, in full view of the Trojan walls, leave the horse on the beach as a religious offering, and wait. The Greeks thought he was insane, burning their own camp, trusting 10 years of war to a piece of theatre, but they had no other ideas. And Odysseus had a way of presenting plans that made the alternatives feel worse. He was the one who climbed inside the horse. He lay in the dark with the other men, in a space barely large enough to breathe, on a beach that smelled of ash from the camp they had just burned. They did not speak. They did not move. They heard the Trojans find the horse, heard them arguing about what to do with it, heard a woman walk around the outside, speaking in the voices of their wives, testing them, and not one man inside made a sound. They heard the gates of Troy open. They heard the horse being dragged up the hill, through the walls that had held for 10 years. The Trojans celebrated that night. They had watched the Greek fleet sail away. They had brought what they believed was a sacred gift inside their city. The war was over. They drank. They sang. Eventually, they slept, in the darkness inside the horse. Odysseus waited until the sounds outside changed from celebration to silence. Then he opened the trapdoor. What happened next lasted one night. Troy had stood for 10 years of siege, and it fell before dawn. To men coming out of a wooden horse. The fires started at the gates. The killing moved inward through streets that the Trojans had lived in their whole lives. By morning, the city that had seemed unbreakable was smoke and ash, and the sound of people who had survived trying to understand what that survival would look like now. Odysseus stood in the ruins and looked at what his idea had built. He had won. The plan had worked exactly as he said it would. He could go home now. Those were true things. Also true 3,000 years later. The word Trojan still means something built to look like a gift, while hiding something dangerous inside. He had put his name on an idea, and the idea had outlasted Troy, outlasted Greece, outlasted every king who had sailed to that beach. He walked through the burning city and tried to feel like a man who had won. The fleet assembled on the beach. The survivors counted what was left. Ships that had come full left with empty benches. Odysseus found his 12 ships. His crew, the men who knew his face, and the sound of his voice, and the name of his son. He stood at the bow as they pulled away from the Trojan coast. For the first time in 10 years. Everything ahead of him was home. He did not know yet what was behind him. He did not know that the gods were watching the Greek fleet leave with very different feelings about what the Greeks had done during that last night in Troy. He did not know that one of those gods was already deciding that his trip home was going to test whether a man was actually who he thought he was. He just stood at the bow and watched Troy disappear. He had been gone 10 years. He would be gone for 10 more. Here is something that gets lost in the way the story is usually told. When the Greek fleet left Troy, Odysseus expected to be home in weeks, maybe a month if the winds were difficult. Ithaca was not far. As ancient sea voyages went, he had made the trip before. He knew the route, knew the currents, knew the seasonal winds. He had 12 ships and a crew that had survived 10 years of war and wanted nothing more than to sleep in their own beds. The 10 years that followed were not a plan. They were not an adventure he chose. They were what happened when the universe decided that surviving the war was not sufficient qualification for getting home. The gods of the ancient world were not distant or abstract. They were present, opinionated, and perfectly willing to involve themselves in the lives of specific human beings for extended periods of time. Odysseus had made enemies, the kind you could not negotiate with, could not defeat in a fair fight, the kind that could stir up a storm in the middle of a calm sea and feel entirely righteous about it. The problem had started before he left Troy. During that last night, when the Greeks were moving through the burning city, some of them had done things in the temples that the gods who owned those temples considered a serious violation. Ajax the Lesser had committed an act of sacrilege against Athena that made her, who had been the Greeks' most powerful divine supporter throughout the war, change sides in the final hours. Poseidon, god of the sea, had his own grievances. The winds that should have been reliable had opinions. The fleet left Troy in late autumn, which was already a problem. The sailing season in the Aegean was not forgiving of late starts. A storm caught them south of the Greek mainland, the kind that the ancient sailors called a sign of divine displeasure. It drove them off course, past the mainland, out into waters that were not on any route that led to Ithaca. When the storm broke and Odysseus could take his bearings, he was somewhere that was not where he was supposed to be, with ships that had taken damage, and men who had used up most of the goodwill they had been running on since Troy. Agamemnon's fleet and his fleet had already separated in the first serious weather. The great armada that had sat on the Trojan beach for 10 years came apart in the first storm, and most of those captains never saw each other again. What happened to them is a different story, or many different stories. Agamemnon made it home to find his wife had taken a lover in his absence, and his homecoming lasted approximately one evening before it turned into a murder. Other captains were wrecked, drowned, delayed, changed by the journey into men their families did not recognize. The war had ended. The returns were sometimes worse than the fighting. Odysseus had 12 ships. He landed on the coast of a people called the Cyclones, who lived near Troy and had been allies of the Trojans, and he raided their city. This was war behavior. The thing you did to an enemy settlement when you had the force and the opportunity. They took what they came for, and Odysseus gave the order to leave. His men did not leave. They had been at war for 10 years. They were on a beach with wine and livestock, and the particular giddiness of men who had stopped believing they might actually die, and had decided this called for a celebration. Odysseus told them to get back to the ships. They kept celebrating. He told them again. They had one more drink. In the morning the Cyclones came back with reinforcements. 6 men from every ship. 72 men who had made it through 10 years of war at Troy died on a beach because they wanted one more night. Odysseus pulled the survivors onto the ships and got them out while the fighting was still possible to escape. And he sat at the bow and understood something that was going to be true for the rest of this voyage. He was going to make the right call, and something was going to go wrong anyway. He was going to keep losing people. He did not know yet how many. He did not know that of the hundreds of men who had left Ithaca with him on 12 ships, he was going to arrive home alone, without a single ship, without a single crew member, clinging to wreckage and washed ashore on an island where a goddess had decided he was interesting enough to keep. He knew the number, 72, and he knew the direction of home. He pointed the ships that way. A storm caught them south of the mainland again. The kind of storm that came when the season had turned and the sea had stopped cooperating with human plans. It drove them past Cythera, past any route that led somewhere recognizable, into the open Mediterranean where the wind went and the current went, and there was nothing to do but hold on and wait for it to stop. When it stopped, they found land. They rested. They fixed what could be fixed. Then they kept going, not because the options ahead looked promising, because the only alternative to going somewhere was staying where they were. And where they were was nowhere that Odysseus intended to spend the rest of his life. The direction of this story changes here. Everything that follows. Every island and every monster and every god. Every catastrophe and every temptation happens because Odysseus cannot get the wind to blow the right way. That sounds simple. A man and some bad weather. But the ancient ocean was not the ocean we cross now with engines and instruments. The ancient ocean was a place where the difference between the right wind and the wrong wind was the difference between home and never coming home at all. Odysseus was the best sailor in his world, and he could not make the wind cooperate. He was the most intelligent man in his world, and he could not think his way out of a storm. He was the most determined man you will ever hear about, and he spent 10 years unable to turn that determination into forward movement, because the thing standing between him and home was not a problem that intelligence or determination could solve. It was a god, with a long memory and unlimited time. Back on Ithaca, Penelope was starting to understand that no news was not the same as good news. She did not say this out loud. There was no one to say it to. Not in the way she meant. Not the version of it that included everything she was calculating behind, the careful surface she showed to the rest of the island. She managed the household. She managed the servants. She managed the expectations of people who came to ask about Odysseus and left with whatever answer made them feel better, because their comfort required less from her than the truth did. At night, she sat alone and did the math. The war was over. The ships had left Troy. Other men were coming home. Or news was coming home that they were not coming home. And either way, the families on other islands knew something. She knew nothing. And the longer the nothing lasted, the more it weighed. She had a son who was going to need his father. She had a household that was going to need a king. She had an island that had already started watching her, the way that people watched a woman whose husband had been gone too long, with the specific attention of those who were beginning to calculate what would happen next. She put those calculations away at night and took them back out in the morning. Because what else was there to do? She kept waiting, on the water, not far enough away, and not close enough to matter. Odysseus stood at the bow of his ship and looked at the horizon. He had been going in the right direction. He was sure of that. Mostly sure. As sure as a man could be without landmarks or stars, he recognized. Then the wind changed. It always changed. He adjusted. He recalculated. He looked at the water and looked at the sky and made the best decision available to him with the information he had, which was what he had always done and would keep doing, all the way to the end of this, whenever the end of this turned out to be. The fleet moved on. What waited ahead was an island with no name that anyone would remember later, where 3 men would be sent to scout and would not come back. And the world that had already taken so much from him would reveal that it was not finished yet, not by a long way, and the worst of it had not even started. He stood at the bow. He watched the horizon. He kept going. The island had no name that anyone remembered later. It was a stop, the kind the ancient Mediterranean forced on sailors constantly, a place to pull the ships up onto the beach. Let the men sleep on solid ground. Fill the water jugs. Eat something that was not whatever had been sitting in the hold since the last stop. 12 ships. The crew exhausted, salt, crusted, running on the relief of having left Troy and the anxiety of not being home yet. Odysseus sent 3 men ahead to see what kind of people lived here. Standard procedure. You did not walk an entire crew into an unknown settlement. You sent scouts. You found out if the people were friendly, if there was food to trade for, if there was any reason to be careful. 3 men. The thing a careful captain did. The 3 men walked into the island's interior and did not come back. Odysseus waited. Then he went himself. He found them under a tree on a low hillside, lying in the loose, easy way that bodies arranged themselves when every muscle had let go of every tension it had ever held. Their eyes were open and soft. Their faces carried the expression of men who had just been told something that settled every question they had ever asked. They were not dead. They were somewhere that looked, from the outside, considerably better than awake. Around them on the ground were flowers, pale and small. They had eaten them. Something in those flowers had reached into these 3 men and turned off the part of the mind that remembered why it needed to be somewhere else. These were the lotus eaters. And what they offered was not poison, and not violence, and not any of the dangers Odysseus had learned to watch for over 10 years of war. They offered the erasure of wanting, the mercy of forgetting that you were supposed to be somewhere else, that someone was waiting, that there was a reason you had been moving in a particular direction for a very long time. Odysseus grabbed the first man by the arm and pulled him upright. The man came without resistance, still wearing that expression of total peace. Odysseus got an arm under his shoulder and started walking him back toward the ships. The man cried, slow, quiet tears, not from pain, from being pulled away from something he had just found and had not had long enough with. Odysseus did not stop walking. He came back for the second man. Then the third. He had the crew lash all 3 of them under the rowing benches until the island was far enough behind them that the flowers were only a memory. The men stopped crying eventually. They sat up and looked around and started to remember, slowly, who they were and where they had been going. None of them talked about what it had felt like. But Odysseus had seen their faces under that tree. He had seen men who were no longer in pain. He stood at the bow as the island dropped behind them and turned that over in his mind. He had been moving toward home with the single-minded focus that had kept him alive through 10 years of war. He had not let himself think about how much things hurt, about the men who had died at Ismara, about 10 years of a war that had eaten people he had known and respected, about the particular ache of missing a child who would be walking and talking now. A child he did not know yet. He had not let himself think about any of it, because thinking about it did not get him home. The men under that tree had stopped thinking about all of it, and they had looked, for those few minutes, like they were fine. He could not want that. He would not let himself want that. But he had seen it, and now he knew it existed. And the knowing was its own kind of weight to carry. The fleet moved on. There was nothing on the horizon but water and the light changing on the surface, and the sound of oars when the wind went wrong. The men who had been under the tree were quiet for the rest of that day, coming back to themselves slowly, reintegrating into a world that required things of them and had a destination attached to it. Odysseus watched them come back and felt something that was not quite relief. He had brought them back from a place that had looked, from the outside, like happiness. He was not entirely sure he had done them a favor. But the ships were moving and Ithaca was still a direction, and that was the only thing he allowed himself to hold on to as the nameless island disappeared into the haze behind them. The next island had a harbor that looked perfect. That was the first sign, though none of them knew it yet. The best traps always looked like gifts. This harbor was calm, sheltered on 3 sides by high cliffs, the water barely moving inside it. The kind of natural formation that sailors remembered for years and told each other about in ports across the Aegean. 11 ships went inside. Odysseus kept his ship at the mouth. He could not have told you exactly why. There was nothing visibly wrong with the harbor. No obvious threat. No sound from the cliffs. No sign of anything unusual on the shoreline. Something about the stillness. Something about how quiet the cliffs were. Something his mind noticed, before his mind could name what it had noticed. He sent scouts up the cliff road to find water and see what lived here. The scouts found a girl drawing water from a spring. She led them to her father's house without speaking. They walked in and found themselves looking at a woman the size of a mountain who called for her husband. And the husband, when he came, was larger than the woman, and neither of them were human in any sense. The scouts had a framework for. The scouts ran. They did not make it back to the ships before the alarm went up. The Laestrygonians gathered on the cliff tops above the harbor. They gathered in numbers that the men below could not accurately count because the men below were too busy understanding what was happening. They picked up rocks, the kind of rocks that cliffs were made of, the kind that when they hit the water in an enclosed harbor did not splash so much as rearrange everything in the immediate vicinity. 11 ships, cliffs on 3 sides, no room to maneuver, boulders coming down from above. The men in those ships had survived Troy. They had fought in infantry combat at rates that killed professional soldiers, and they had come through. They had survived the cyclones and the storm, and 6 days of hard rowing to get here. They had about 4 minutes. The boulders hit the water and the ships, and in some cases, the men directly. And the Laestrygonians waded into the shallows and speared the survivors like fish, which was approximately how they were thinking about this. And the harbor that had looked like a gift became the place where 11 crews died in an afternoon. Odysseus was outside the harbor. He drew his sword and cut the rope tying his ship to the shore. He told the men on the oars to row, and they rowed. Hard, out into open water, away from the sound and the splashing and the voices of the Laestrygonians, carrying across the water in a language none of them had heard before and did not want to hear again. He stood at the stern and watched the harbour mouth get smaller. Nothing in that harbour was still moving in a way that suggested survival. The men on the oars rowed until they could not hear anything. And then they kept rowing until the cliffs were a line. And then, not even that. No one spoke. The only sounds were the oars and the water and the breathing of men who had just watched 11 ships full of people they knew die in an afternoon, and were still processing that fact against the ongoing reality of their own heartbeats. 12 ships had left Ithaca. 1 remained. He let the men row until they found a beach with no cliffs above it. He ran the ship up onto the sand. The men climbed out and did what human beings did after catastrophic loss, which was to sit down wherever they found themselves and make sounds that were not quite words. Odysseus sat with them. He did not deliver a speech. He did not talk about Ithaca or the route or the morning. He sat on the beach with what was left of his fleet. 1 ship, and did the arithmetic that he had been doing since Ismara, and did not like the direction the numbers kept going in. They had left Ithaca with hundreds of men on 12 ships. Every stop had cost them someone. Ismara had cost them 72. Now it was 11 ships at once. He was the reason they were here. He had led them here. He had made every decision, correctly or incorrectly, that had brought them to this beach, this single ship, this number of surviving men, which was a fraction of the number that had set out. He did not let himself sit with that for long. Sitting with it did not fix it, but he sat with it long enough to know what it weighed, far away on Ithaca. Penelope sat alone at the loom in the evening light and thought about the same numbers from the other direction. She had heard news of the fleet scattering in the storms. She had heard names of men who had made it home and names of men who had not. She ran through every piece of information she had and arrived at the same place she always arrived. Not enough. She picked up the thread and kept going. In the morning, Odysseus told his men to take up the oars. They took them up. He pointed the ship south. There was another island ahead. There was always another island. This one had forest and hills and the sound of running water, which was the minimum a sailor needed to consider stopping. And they stopped. He sent half the crew to scout while the other half stayed with the ship. The scouting party came back with faces he had learned to read over 10 years of being the person people reported bad news to. They had found a house in the middle of the forest. Stone walls, high roof, wood smoke around the house, lying in the grass like large dogs who had forgotten why they were supposed to be fierce, were wolves and lions, just lying there, calm, with the eyes of things that had once been something else. One of the men said they had heard singing inside. Odysseus looked at what was left of his crew and made the calculation. They needed food. They needed information. They needed whatever this island had to offer, because the alternative was going back out on a sea that had been eating them steadily since Troy. He sent 22 men to go back to the house. He watched them walk into the trees. The island was called Aea, though they did not know that yet. The woman inside the stone house was named Circe, though they did not know that yet either. And what was about to happen in that house was going to change the shape of everything still to come. What the remaining men on the beach knew was that the scouting party did not come back. They had learned what that meant. The cave was the size of a house, larger than a house, the kind of space that made you recalibrate your sense of what scale meant, where the ceiling was high enough that the lamplight did not reach it, and the shadows above were permanent. Along the far wall, enormous rounds of cheese drying on racks, pens full of lambs, separated by age with the methodical organization of someone who took their livestock seriously, pails of whey, a fire pit ringed with stones, each the size of a man's torso. The men with Odysseus wanted to grab the cheese and the lambs and leave. Get back to the ship before whoever lived here came home. This was the right idea. Odysseus said no. He wanted to see the owner. He was curious about what kind of host a person would be when they lived in a cave this size, with this much cheese and this many lambs. He was also After 10 years of war and months of bad weather and dead men and the wrong horizon, in the specific mood that exhausted people sometimes fell into, where they wanted something to happen, even if they could not say exactly what. They waited. The ground shook before they heard anything. Then they heard it. Something enormous moving through the world in a way that did not concern itself with the things in its path. Then the shadow of it filled the cave entrance. Then it came inside. A cyclops, one eye in the center of its face, set above a nose that had been broken and reset badly, above a mouth that had not learned to be careful. It was roughly the size of a small building. It dumped a load of firewood from its shoulders that shook the floor and rattled the cheese racks. It drove the female sheep inside, sealed the cave entrance with a boulder that would have taken 20 men working together to move, lit the fire. Then it saw them. Odysseus was already running the numbers. One entrance. Sealed. Men too small to matter in a fight with something this size. Sheep. Cheese racks. An immovable rock. The Cyclops asked who they were. Odysseus told it they were soldiers coming home from Troy. Asked it to honor the laws of hospitality. Reminded it what Zeus required of hosts. The Cyclops said it did not care about Zeus. Then it grabbed 2 of Odysseus's men, one in each hand, and killed them, and ate them, in the silence after. Odysseus stood very still and did not react in any way that would make the situation worse. He was calculating. 2 men down. Exit sealed. Nothing good available. But one of the things he had learned in 10 years of war was that the moment you stopped calculating was the moment you started dying. He looked at the Cyclops. He looked at a sharpened stake someone had dropped. He looked at the wine they had brought from the ship. He began to build a plan. The Cyclops ate breakfast the next morning, which was 2 more of Odysseus's men, then left for the day with its flock, rolling the boulder back from outside with the efficiency of something that had done this every day of its very long life. In the dark of the cave, Odysseus found the enormous wooden club the Cyclops used as a walking stick and had his men sharpen the end of it to a point and harden that point in the embers of the fire. That evening, when the Cyclops came home, Odysseus offered it wine, good wine, the kind that had been given to him in Troy as a sacred gift, strong enough that you were supposed to cut it with 20 parts water before drinking it. He gave it straight, refilled the cup twice, watched the thing drink with the enthusiasm of a creature that had never encountered anything like it. The Cyclops asked his name. Odysseus said, "Nobody." The Cyclops laughed and said that for the gift of this wine, it would eat. Nobody laughed. Then it passed out. Odysseus drove the sharpened stake into the fire until the point glowed red. Then he and his men drove it into the Cyclops' eye. The sound the Cyclops made brought the others, their voices calling through the stone from outside what is wrong. The blinded one screamed that nobody was hurting it. Nobody had blinded it. Nobody was killing it. The voices outside said, "Well, if nobody is hurting you, it must be an illness from Zeus. Go pray." They left. In the morning, the Cyclops rolled back the boulder to let the flock out. Sitting in the entrance with its arms spread to catch any men trying to escape, Odysseus tied his men under the bellies of the rams. 1 man per animal, hidden in the wool. The Cyclops ran its hands over the backs of each animal as they passed, feeling for stowaways. It found nothing. They got out. They ran. They reached the ship and pushed off from the shore, and the oars hit the water, and the distance between them and that cave began to open, and Odysseus stood at the stern and felt the wild, specific relief of being alive when the math had been suggesting something else. Then he opened his mouth. "Cyclops," he shouted across the water, "if anyone asks who blinded you, tell them it was Odysseus, son of Laert, from Ithaca." His men grabbed at him. They begged him to stop. They were out. They were alive. The island was behind them. Why was he doing this? "Please stop." He did not stop. He needed the Cyclops to know. He had spent 10 years of war doing brilliant things in the service of other men's glory, under Agamemnon's command, fighting for Menelaus's wife, being the indispensable mind behind other men's victories. He had built the horse that ended the war, and history was going to give Agamemnon the credit for winning it. He had saved lives no one would count and solved problems no one would ever know had existed. For 10 years he had been nobody, in a different sense. He was not nobody. He was Odysseus, son of Laerte, from Ithaca, and he had just blinded the son of Poseidon with a burning stick. And he needed that to be known. The Cyclops heard him. It picked up a piece of cliff and threw it in the direction of the voice. The boulder nearly sank the ship. Then it raised its hands to its father, to Poseidon, who ruled the sea. And it prayed, let Odysseus not make it home, or if he must, let him arrive, late and alone, on a foreign ship, after losing all his companions, to find nothing but trouble waiting. Poseidon heard. Poseidon was always listening. Odysseus stood at the stern as the island fell behind them, the cheering of his men filling his ears. And he did not know yet what he had just done. He had given the god who owned the ocean a name to attach his anger to. He had traded anonymity for acknowledgement, and the price was going to be everything. But in that moment, with the cave behind him and the sky ahead and his name still echoing off the cliffs, he did not regret it. He would not let himself regret it. Not yet. After the Cyclops, the fleet sailed north. The men who had been in that cave did not talk about it. That was the thing about the kind of fear that got all the way into your body, that shook your hands and emptied your stomach and made you understand in a way that was entirely physical that you were a small creature in a world that contained things much larger and more indifferent than you. When it was over, you did not want to talk about it. You wanted to put distance between yourself and the place where it happened and watch that place get smaller until it was gone. They put distance between themselves and the island. The 11 other ships were waiting where Odysseus had left them. The captains came aboard to hear what had happened and stood in silence as Odysseus told them. The men who had not been in the cave looked at the men who had been in the cave and saw something different in their faces, some quality replaced by its absence. And they did not ask questions. They sailed. Wind took them northeast, toward an island that floated, steep bronze walls rising from the sea, an island inside them that actually moved. This was the domain of Aeolus, keeper of the winds, appointed by the gods to manage the weather of the world the way a steward managed a large estate. Aeolus was hospitable in the way that powerful people were sometimes hospitable to interesting guests. He kept Odysseus and his crew for a full month, feeding them, listening to the story of Troy with the attention of a man who had all the time in the world. When the month was over and Odysseus said it was time to go, Aeolus did something that felt like an extraordinary gift. He caught all the winds, every wind, except the one that would carry Odysseus home, the west wind, the one that would push the ships in the right direction. All the others he bundled and tied into a leather bag made from the hide of a 9-year-old ox. And he gave that bag to Odysseus and told him to keep it sealed. Inside was everything that could go wrong with the weather between here and Ithaca. As long as the bag stayed closed, the west wind would carry them home. Odysseus tied the bag himself, with silver cord, with the care of a man who understood that the object in his hands was the difference between home and not home. He put it under his bench at the bow, where he slept, where no one could reach it without reaching past him first. Then he did something that made sense from the inside and was a catastrophe from the outside. He did not tell his men what was in the bag. He gave them no explanation, no reason to understand why this particular bag mattered more than any other cargo on the ship. He just kept it under his bench and watched it and said nothing, because that was how Odysseus had always operated. He processed information privately and released it on a need-to-know basis. trusting his own judgment about what people needed to know and when. It had kept him alive for years. It was going to cost him everything in about 9 days. For 9 days and 9 nights it worked. The west wind pushed them steadily home, and the sea was calm, and the mood on the ships was the best it had been since Troy. They were going home. They could feel it. That shift in the atmosphere, when the direction you were moving finally matched the direction you wanted to be going. On the 9th night, Odysseus fell asleep. He had not slept properly in 9 days. He had been at the bow every hour, watching the bag, watching the horizon, watching the crew. 9 days of that, and his body simply stopped cooperating. He sat down at his post and his eyes closed, and he went under the way exhausted people went under. Completely and without warning. He was asleep when the crew had the conversation. It was not a malicious conversation. It was the conversation of men who had been watching their captain guard a bag for 9 days without explaining why. They talked quietly among themselves about what might be inside. Someone pointed out that Aeolus was known for his wealth. Someone else noted that their captain had received this bag privately and had said nothing about it to anyone. The math assembled itself without any of them meaning for it to. Whatever was in that bag was probably treasure. Gold, maybe. Gifts from Aeolus to Odysseus alone, not shared with the crew. They had fought the same war. They had survived the same 10 years. Why should their captain come home rich, while they came home with nothing? One of them untied the silver cord. The winds came out. Every wind that Aeolus had bundled erupted simultaneously, and the noise of it woke Odysseus from the deepest sleep he had managed in 9 days. He came awake to chaos. The ships were spinning. The sea had gone from calm to violent before he could get to his feet. The west wind was swallowed by everything else, by north and south and east, all happening at once. And the fleet was moving but toward nothing good, driven by winds that had no direction except away. In the first seconds, Odysseus understood everything. He looked at the bag. Open, the silver cord hanging loose. He looked at his men, already understanding what they had done, already wearing the faces of people who knew an irreversible thing had just happened. He looked at the horizon. He could see Ithaca. That was the detail that had to be understood to feel the full weight of this moment. 9 days out from the floating island, on a direct westward bearing, with favorable wind and no obstacles. On the 9th night, close enough to see the shape of the hills he had grown up on. Close enough that the men on watch might have seen the fires of the harbour if the night had been clearer. Someone had opened a bag. He stood at the bow and looked at the coastline of his home and watched the wind take him away from it. He picked up the silver cord. He coiled it neatly. He set it aside. He went to the men at the oars and told them what they needed to do to keep the ship stable in the wind. He did not rage at them. He did not tell them what they had done. He told them where to put their hands and what angle to hold the oars and how to read the waves. He managed the disaster because there was nothing else to do. Back to the floating island they went. Back to Aeolus, with empty hands, and a story that Aeolus heard with the expression of a man confronted with a problem. That was not actually his problem. He had given Odysseus the gift. The gift had been misused. That was a human situation, and Aeolus's sympathy ran in a different direction. He would not help again. He told Odysseus to leave. He said, a man this hated by the gods was not someone he was going to stick his neck out for a second time. He said it without cruelty, the way a sensible person declined to put their hand back into something that had already bitten it. Odysseus took his fleet and sailed away from the floating island with nothing but the oars and whatever wind happened to be available, which was not the west wind, which was not the wind that went toward Ithaca. He sat in the bow and let the men row because rowing was something to do, and something to do was better than nothing to do when the alternative was sitting with the knowledge of what had just happened. Behind him, on an island they would never see again, a leather bag lay empty on the floor of a palace. Inside that bag had been the fastest way home, far to the west. So far it was not even a shape on the horizon. The fires of Ithaca burned on without him. On Ithaca, that same night, Penelope sat in the room where she had begun her weaving. She was working on a large piece now, a shroud for Laertes, Odysseus's father, who was very much alive, but for whom she had announced, with the gravity appropriate to such announcements. She needed to complete a proper burial cloth before she could, in good conscience, think about anything else. The suitors had started arriving in the 3rd year. Not all at once. A few at first. Men from the neighboring islands who had heard that the king of Ithaca had not come home yet, and that the queen was alone. They came to court her, which was the word the situation used for what was actually a slow-motion occupation of her house. She had not yet found the tool that would hold them off. The shroud was that tool, and she had just begun to understand it. She wove a row in the firelight and looked at what she had made and thought about what she was really building. Not cloth. Time. She needed time, and she had just found a way to make it. 6 days after leaving the floating island, they found a harbor. Beautiful. That was the important thing to establish first, because it explained the decision that followed. The decision that felt right and was the worst one. The harbor was large and calm, surrounded by high cliffs on 3 sides that blocked the wind and sheltered the water into something that barely moved. The kind of harbor that experienced sailors called a gift. The kind of natural formation the ancient Mediterranean offered, rarely. 11 ships went inside. Odysseus kept his ship at the mouth. He could not have told you exactly why. Nothing was visibly wrong. No obvious threat. No sound from the cliffs. No sign of anything unusual on the shoreline. It was instinct. The specific instinct of a man who had been reading situations his entire adult life and had learned to trust what his mind noticed before it could name what it had noticed. Something about the stillness. Something about how quiet those cliffs were. He kept his ship at the mouth of the harbor and sent scouts up the cliff road. The scouts found a girl drawing water from a spring and asked her where they were. She led them to her father's house without speaking, and they walked in and found themselves looking at a woman the size of a mountain who called for her husband. And the husband, when he came, was larger than the woman, and neither of them were human in any sense. The scouts had a framework for. The scouts ran. They did not make it back to the ships before the alarm went up. The Laestrygonians gathered on the cliff tops above the harbor in numbers the men below could not accurately count, because the men below were focused on understanding what was happening. They gathered on the cliff tops, and they picked up rocks. The kind of rocks that cliffs were made of. The kind that when they hit the water in a harbor with no room to maneuver, did not splash so much as displace everything in the vicinity, including ships. 11 ships. Cliffs on 3 sides. Nowhere to go. The boulders came down. The men in those ships had survived Troy. They had fought in close infantry combat that killed professional soldiers at catastrophic rates, and they had come through. They had survived the cyclones and the storm and the cyclops and the bag of winds and 6 days of hard rowing to get here. They had about 4 minutes. The boulders hit the water and the ships, and in some cases the men directly. And the Laestrygonians waded into the shallows and speared the survivors like fish. And the harbor that had looked like a gift became the place where 11 crews died in an afternoon. Odysseus was outside the harbor. He drew his sword and cut the rope, tying his ship to the shore. He told the men on the oars to row, and they rowed. Hard. Out into open water. Away from the sound and the splashing and the screaming and the voices of the Laestrygonians carrying across the water in a language none of them had heard before and did not want to hear again. He stood at the stern and watched the harbor mouth get smaller. Nothing in that harbor was still moving in a way that suggested survival. The men rowed until they could hear nothing from the harbor. Then they kept rowing until the cliffs were small. And then, not even that. Nobody spoke. The only sounds were the oars and the water and the breathing of men who had just watched 11 ships full of people they knew die in the space of one afternoon, and were sitting with that fact against the ongoing reality of their own heartbeats, 12 ships had left Ithaca with Odysseus. One remained. He let the men row until they found a beach sheltered enough to stop at. He ran the ship up onto the sand. The men climbed out and did what human beings did after catastrophic loss, which was to sit down wherever they found themselves and make sounds that were not quite words. Odysseus sat with them. He did not deliver a speech. He did not talk about what came next. He sat on the beach with what was left of his fleet, one ship, and let himself do the count. They had left Ithaca with hundreds of men on 12 ships. Ismara had cost them 72. The harbour had cost them 11 ships at once. He was the reason they were here. Every decision that had brought them to this beach was his. He did not let himself sit with that for long, because sitting with it did not fix it. But he sat with it long enough to know what it weighed. In the morning he told the men to take up the oars. They took them up. They were the kind of men that 10 years of war produced. Men who had learned that the only alternative to going somewhere was staying where you were. And staying where you were was sometimes the most dangerous option of all. They rowed south. Eventually they found another island. Forest and hills and the sound of running water. Odysseus sent half the crew to scout while the other half stayed with the ship. The scouting party came back with the faces he had learned to read over 10 years of being the person people reported bad news to. They had found a house in the middle of the forest. Stone walls, wood smoke around the house. Lying in the grass with the wrong kind of stillness were wolves and lions, just lying there, calm, with the eyes of things that had once been something else. One of the men said they had heard singing inside. Odysseus looked at what was left of his crew and made the calculation. They needed food. They needed information. They needed whatever this island offered, because the alternative was going back out onto a sea that had been eating them steadily since Troy. He sent 22 men to go back to the house. He watched them walk into the trees. The island was called Aea, though they did not know that yet. The woman inside the stone house was named Circe, though they did not know that either. What was about to happen in that house in the next hour was going to change the shape of everything still to come. What the remaining men on the beach knew was that the scouting party did not come back. They had learned what that meant. Odysseus strapped on his sword and walked into the trees alone. He had not gotten far when the forest changed quality around him. The way forests changed, when something in them was paying attention. Then the god Hermes appeared to him in the form of a young man, which was the form Hermes preferred when he needed to talk to human beings who were likely to panic at the sight of something obviously divine. Hermes told him where he was going and who was there and what she had done to his men. Circe, he said, was a goddess with the power of transformation, of the movement between states, of what happened when one thing became another thing. His men were pigs. She had a drug she mixed into food and drink, and when men consumed it, she touched them with her wand, and they became whatever animal she decided they should be. She was going to try the same thing on Odysseus. Hermes gave him an herb that would counteract the drug. He told him what to do when the transformation failed, and Circe looked at him with the expression of someone confronted with something that was not supposed to be possible. Then Hermes left. Odysseus walked the rest of the way to the house. What waited inside was not quite what he expected, and not quite what anything had prepared him for. And he was about to spend a year there before anyone who loved him saw his face again. He walked through the door. She was standing at a loom when he came in, singing something to herself in a low voice, and she looked up at him without surprise. That was the first thing he noticed. Not alarm, not curiosity, not the expression of a woman confronted with an uninvited guest. She looked up with the calm of someone who had been expecting him, or someone who had been expecting something like him, and had already decided how this would go. She invited him in. She sat him down. She mixed the drink herself, with the drug in it, the way she had done for 22 men before him. and she gave it to him with a smile that had a specific quality to it. The smile of someone who had done this enough times to be bored by how it ended. He drank it. Nothing happened. The smile changed. Something moved behind her eyes that was not boredom and not confidence. She reached for her wand. Odysseus drew his sword. She looked at the sword and then at him with the expression of someone doing a rapid reassessment of a situation she thought she had already assessed. Men who drank the drug became animals. That was the rule. That was what always happened. She had never had to think about what came after, because there had never been an after. Now there was a man standing in her house with a sword who had drunk what she gave him and was still a man, looking at her with the flat, patient expression of someone who had been in worse situations than this and was waiting to see what she did. She went to her knees, not because he frightened her. Exactly. Because he was the first person to walk into this house and remain himself after drinking what she gave him. In years of turning men into animals, she had never met someone who could not be turned, someone who could look at the thing she was and not become something lesser in response. She swore an oath that she would do him no harm. He put the sword away. He told her to free his men. She went to the pen and touched each of them with her wand, and they came back, emerging from the animal shapes the way people emerged from bad dreams, shaking and disoriented, and then suddenly, overwhelmingly present, standing in the sunlight outside a goddess's house and touching their own faces to verify the information. They cried. He held them and let them cry, which was not something that happened often in the world he came from, where men were expected to perform their emotions in specific narrow registers, and open weeping was not one of them. But these were his men, and they had been pigs, and now they were men again. And sometimes what happened was that a person cried, and Odysseus did not have the energy left to pretend that was not a reasonable response. He went back to the beach and got the rest of the crew. They moved into Circe's house. She was a remarkable host. The food was real food, the kind that restored rather than transformed. And the wine was good. And the beds were actual beds. She had knowledge, the kind that came from being a goddess with access to information about the world that most human beings never encountered. She and Odysseus talked. He told her about Troy. She told him things about the sea he had not known. She looked at him the way very few people had ever looked at him. She looked at the actual mechanism of how he thought, not the result of it. Most people saw the trick after it worked. She saw the trick being constructed. That was an unusual experience for a man who had spent his life being the most complicated thinker in every room he entered. A month passed. The men were rested and fed, and not in immediate danger for the first time since leaving Troy. Odysseus knew he should be moving. Every day on this island was another day that Telemachus grew older, without a father. Another day that Penelope held off whatever she was holding off, by whatever means she was using to hold it off. Ithaca was still a direction he was not moving in. He stayed anyway. Another month. The men stopped talking about home the way they had talked about it in the first weeks, with the raw urgency of people who could almost feel it. They started talking about it the way people talked about a plan they would get to eventually. The edge came off the wanting. The island was warm. The food was consistent. Nothing was trying to kill them. Odysseus noticed what was happening and made himself notice it, because noticing things was the only protection he had against the version of the lotus flower that did not look like a flower at all. He had seen men under that tree on the island of the lotus eaters, and he had seen their faces, and he understood that comfort was its own trap when it came in a place that was not home. He understood this. He stayed anyway. It was Eurylochus who finally said what needed to be said. He stood up at dinner one evening and looked at Odysseus and said, "We have been here long enough. We are forgetting what we came from. We need to go home, or we are going to forget that home exists." Eurylochus was not a subtle man. He was the kind of man who said the obvious thing out loud when everyone else was finding reasons not to. In this case, the obvious thing was correct, and Odysseus knew it and had been waiting. He realized, for someone else to say it so he did not have to be the one to break the spell. He went to Circe that night. She did not argue with him. She had known this was coming in the way that people who pay attention always knew the things that were coming. She told him that before he went home he had to go somewhere else first. Somewhere no living person went voluntarily. He had to go to the land of the dead. He had to find the soul of a blind prophet named Tiresias, who knew the past and the present and the shape of what was still to come, and ask him how to get home. Without that, Circe said, the ocean was going to keep eating him, one crew member at a time, until there was nothing left to eat. Odysseus sat with that information for a long moment. Then he went and woke his men. There was one thing he had to do first, something he had not done, because there had not seemed to be a right moment, and there was still not a right moment, but there was no longer time to wait for one. A young man named Elpenor, reliable and willing, not the most capable sailor Odysseus had ever worked with, but the kind of man every crew needed, had gotten drunk the night before and climbed up onto the roof of the house to sleep in the open air. In the morning when the shouting started, Elpenor had woken up fast and wrong. The gasping, disoriented awakening that alcohol produced when interrupted, and he had fallen off the roof. The fall had killed him. In the chaos of departure, nobody had stopped. Nobody had gone back. Elpenor was lying at the base of Circe's house, unburied, without the rites that the ancient world believed the dead required to make the crossing into whatever came next. Odysseus had known. He had known, and he had not stopped, because he was already calculating the next problem, and Elpenor was not a problem anymore. In the terrible arithmetic of a voyage that had been reducing people to variables for months, he carried that onto the ship with him. He did not know yet that the next face he would see from his own world, in the dark place where Circe was sending him, would be Elpenor's. The dead had a way of arriving before you were ready for them. The entrance to the underworld was at the edge of the world, not a metaphorical edge, an actual one, where the ocean ran out of light and the water changed color and the air became something heavier than air, a substance you moved through rather than breathed. Circe had given them directions and a north wind and instructions about what to do when they arrived, and none of those instructions had made the destination sound like anywhere a living person would choose to go. They dug the trench at the edge of the grove of Persephone, where the black poplars grew and the willows dropped their fruit without ripening. In the half-light, that was all this place allowed. They poured the offerings in the order Circe had specified: honey mixed with milk, then sweet wine, then water, then white barley. Then Odysseus cut the throats of the sacrificed animals and let the blood run into the trench, because blood was what the dead needed to speak, and without speech there was no point in being here. Then they waited. The dead came like fog when fog had direction, not visible until they were close, and then too close, pressing toward the trench and the blood with the urgency of things that had been without something essential for a very long time. Shades of men and women, young men still wearing the wounds that killed them, old women and men who had simply used up what they had been given, children, breathers, the whole range of human death crowding toward the edge of a trench in the dark at the end of the world. Odysseus held his sword over the trench and let no shade drink until he had spoken with the ones he had come for. The first face he recognized was Elpenor's. The young man who had fallen from the roof of Circe's house stood on the far side of the trench, looking at him with an expression that was not quite accusation, but lived in accusation's neighborhood. He was stuck, not yet fully in the world of the dead, not yet released into whatever came after the crossing. He had not been buried. He had not been given the rites. He was suspended between states. Odysseus could not look away from him. He made a promise right there. In the dark, at the edge of the world, he would go back to Circe's island. He would give Elpenor a proper burial, a pear, his oar planted as a grave marker on the shore. He would do what he should have done before he left. Elpenor's expression did not change exactly, but something in it settled. Then Tiresias came. The prophet was blind in death as he had been in life. But blindness here did not work the way it worked above. He moved through the dark with the confidence of someone who did not need to see to know what was there. He drank from the trench and looked at Odysseus with the unseeing gaze that sighted people found unsettling and blind people learned to deploy with considerable precision. He told him the truth. The voyage home was going to be hard, in a way Odysseus had not yet encountered. The kind of suffering that came not from mistakes or enemies, but from the anger of a god with unlimited patience. Poseidon was not going to stop. The Cyclops had been his son, and the Cyclops had asked for a specific revenge, and Poseidon was honoring that request with the thoroughness that gods brought to things when they decided to be thorough. But there was a way through. The crew had to leave the cattle of the sun god Helios alone. An island where those cattle grazed. Sacred animals. Intouchables. If Odysseus could get his crew past that island without anyone touching them, there was a chance. A real chance. If the cattle were harmed, the crew would die, and Odysseus himself would come home late and alone, on a foreign ship, and he would find trouble waiting at home. He would eventually come home. That was what Tiresias was telling him, in the way of a prophet who could not change what he saw, but could arm you with the knowledge of it. Eventually, alone, to a home that was not going to be easy. Odysseus stood at the edge of the trench and absorbed that. Then his mother appeared. He had not known she was dead. That was the thing that hit him before anything else. Before grief or shock. The simple informational fact that his mother Anticlea was here, which meant she had died while he was away, which meant she was gone in the way that things were gone when there was no coming back. She was smaller than he remembered. Death did that. Or maybe the memory of living people made the living large, and the dead were simply the size they actually were. She moved toward the trench, and he wanted to reach for her, and he could not. Not yet. Not until she had drunk. She drank. She looked at him, and her face did the thing that faces did when a person saw someone they had stopped letting themselves hope to see. She told him she had died of missing him. Not disease. Not age, though age had come. She had run out of the ability to continue waiting in a world where he was absent from it. The grief of not knowing, she said, was different from the grief of knowing. It had no object to settle on and no resolution to move toward. He reached for her. His hands went through her. He tried again. A third time his arms went around the shape of his mother in the dark, and 3 times there was nothing there to hold. Just the cold of this place and his own breath, and the irreversible fact that the dead could not be held, that all the wanting in the world could not make a shade into a body, that the gap between the living and the dead was not a gap that love could close. He lowered his arms. He stood with them empty, and understood something he had not let himself understand before. He had been so focused on getting home that he had not fully reckoned with what was changing at home while he was not there. People he loved had died without him. He could not get back the time. He could not hold his mother. She told him Penelope was faithful and patient and had not given up. That Telemachus held the inheritance intact. That Ithaca was still there. Still waiting. Then she told him to go back to the light. The shades pressed closer after that. Wanting the blood. Wanting the moment of speech. He saw men he had known at Troy. Faces he had not thought about in years because the mind protected itself from certain memories by misfiling them somewhere inaccessible. And now, here they were, available again. Achilles came. He moved through the crowd of the dead the way he had moved through armies, with the authority of someone who could not be stopped. He looked at Odysseus across the trench and asked about his son, about his father. He wanted news of the living with the hunger of the dead. Odysseus told him what he knew. Achilles said, "Do not comfort me about death." He said he would rather be a slave in the world above, the lowest man in the lowest field. than rule as king down here among all the dead. He had chosen the short, glorious life. He had gotten exactly what he chose. And now he was here in the dark, and the glory was somewhere else, in the mouths of living people who were still alive to say the word. He did not say this as advice. He said it the way people stated true things when truth was all that remained. Odysseus looked at him and thought about 10 years on that beach. The two men who had been as different as two men fighting on the same side could be. One who chose brilliance and early death. One who chose cleverness and the long way home. The one who chose the long way home was still here. He turned away from the dead. He went back to the ship. He did not speak for a long time after they pushed off from that shore. The men did not speak either. They had been at the edge of the world of the dead, and they had felt it pressing against them the whole time. And they needed the distance to become distance before they could be in their own bodies again, far away, on an island in the Ionian Sea, in a room with a bed that had roots going down into the earth. Penelope sat in the dark and pulled out the thread she had laid down during the day, unraveling the hours she had woven into the fabric, taking back the time, stitch by stitch, in the only form of patience that did not eventually run out. She did not know where he was tonight. She did not know he was coming back from the place where his mother had told him to come home. She pulled out another stitch. She sat in the dark and waited for the morning to come so she could start again. They went back to Circe's island first. Odysseus had promised Elpenor a burial, and he kept the promise, because in a voyage defined by the gap between what he intended and what actually happened, the keeping of small promises had become the one thing he could control when he could not control anything else. They built the pyre on the shore. They burned the body. They planted the oar at the top of the burial mound, the way Elpenor had asked, a marker that would stand on that beach long after the ship was gone, telling anyone who found it that a man had been here and had been counted and had not been left without a name. Circe came down to the shore while they worked. She brought food for the crew, and she pulled Odysseus aside and told him what was ahead. Not because she was required to, because she chose to. And that choice was itself a kind of information about what those months on the island had meant, or at least what they had produced in her. This specific desire to hand him what he needed to survive the next part. She told him about the sirens, about Scylla and Charybdis, about the cattle of the sun. She told him all of it with the clarity of someone who had access to the full picture and understood that clarity was the only real gift you could give a person before they walked into something dangerous. She told him in the way that people told things to someone they did not expect to see again. In the morning, the crew gathered at the ship. Odysseus stood on the shore a moment and looked back at the house in the trees, the stone walls and the smoke, and the quiet of a place inhabited for a very long time by someone who did not need company to be at peace. Circe was not visible. She was not the kind of person who came down to watch departures. He got on the ship. The north wind carried them south. He told the crew about the sirens with the warning that Circe had given him, knowing the danger and surviving the danger were two entirely different things. And the only reliable method of survival was to remove the choice from the equation entirely. He told the crew to fill their ears with beeswax and row. Under no circumstances were they to remove the wax until he gave the signal that the island was well behind them. One man would be the exception. He told them to lash him to the mast. The crew looked at him. They had followed him through enough inexplicable decisions that they had largely stopped asking for explanations. But this one registered as stranger than usual. Their captain was telling them to tie him to the mast and ignore everything he said afterward. They did it. They lashed him with enough rope that he could not work free regardless of how determined he became, pressed the beeswax into their own ears, settled into the rhythm of rowing. Odysseus stood tied to the mast and watched the island of the sirens appear on the horizon. It looked like nothing, a low shape in the water, with a meadow on it, and bones visible on the shore. The bones of sailors who had heard the singing and gone toward it, and found something else. The meadow looked pleasant. The sky above it was clear. Then the singing started. The sirens did not sound the way danger was supposed to sound. They sounded like truth, like someone who knew everything, knew it completely and without judgment, and was willing to tell him all of it. They sang about Troy, about specific moments he had not told anyone about, things that had happened in the dark or in private that no external witness could have seen. They sang about the night he had stood in the doorway of Telemachus's room before leaving Ithaca. He pulled against the ropes. They sang about the men he had lost, said their names in the order they had died. And the names were right. Everyone right. In the right order. He pulled harder. They were promising him the thing he had not known he wanted until this moment, made it visible to hear his own story told completely and accurately, to know that the full weight of what he had experienced had been witnessed, that the loss and the choices and the 10 years of war and the months on the water and the men who had fallen out of the numbers one by one were known by something outside himself, and therefore were real in the way that things witnessed by only one person were never entirely real. He screamed at the crew to untie him. He could not hear his own voice over the singing. The crew rowed, their backs to him, beeswax in their ears, working the oars with the steady, mechanical efficiency of men who had made a decision to look at one thing and were keeping that decision, Eurylochus at the stroke oar, setting the pace, watching the water ahead. Odysseus pulled at the ropes until his wrists bled. The island slid past. The singing followed them across the water, trailing off slowly the way music trailed off when the source was getting farther away, diminishing rather than stopping. So there was no clear moment when it was gone, just a gradual absence where it had been. When Eurylochus looked back and saw Odysseus had stopped pulling, he signaled the crew to remove the wax. The men closest to Odysseus came to untie him. He stood at the mast for a moment after the ropes came off, not because he was physically unable to move, but because moving meant returning completely to the situation, to the ship, to the water ahead. He had just heard something he would spend the rest of his life being unable to describe to anyone who had not heard it themselves. He moved to the bow. Circe had told him about what came after the sirens in the tone of someone delivering information that was factual and terrible and had to be delivered anyway. The strait between Scylla and Charybdis was not wide. Under other circumstances it would have been unremarkable. A narrow channel between two rocky promontories. Under these circumstances, it was the place where he was going to have to make a decision he had been turning over since Circe described it to him. A decision he had not told the crew about, because there was no version of telling them that did not make the next hour significantly worse. Charybdis was on the left side of the channel, a whirlpool at a scale that transcended the natural, 3 times a day opening and swallowing everything within range. The water spiraling down into a darkness that had no bottom anyone had ever seen, and survived to describe. When it opened, the rocks at the bottom of the sea were briefly visible before the water rushed back in. Scylla was on the right, 12 feet and 6 heads, each head with 3 rows of teeth, each head reaching independently from the cave in the cliff where the body lived, reaching down over passing ships with the patience of something that had been in that cave for a very long time, and had learned that ships came through the channel regularly, and waiting was always rewarded. Circe had been direct about the arithmetic. Take the left side, toward Charybdis, and risk losing everything. A ship that went too close when it opened did not survive. Total loss. Every man. Take the right side, toward Scylla, and lose some men. 6 heads, 6 men, 1 per head, taken from the ship as it passed. 6 men, certainly, against the possibility of everyone, certainly. Odysseus had been calculating this since she told him. He kept the ship to the right. He watched Charybdis as they went through, watched it doing what it did, the water spiraling down with a sound like the end of things, and he kept the ship to the right. and he kept his eyes on Scylla's cliff, because Circe had told him not to, and he had decided he needed to see it coming. He saw it coming. 6 heads came down from the cliff face with the smooth, unhurried movement of things that did not need to hurry. He saw the men they took. He knew their names. He watched them go up into the cliff, still moving, still reaching back toward the ship, reaching for him. And he watched them until Scylla pulled them inside, and the cliff was just a cliff again. The crew rowed in silence. He stood at the bow and did not speak. There had been a moment, right before the heads came down, when he could have warned those specific 6 men to step back from the railing, to get to the center of the ship. He had stood there and not done it because Circe had told him that moving men around the ship would slow the passage, bring them closer to Charybdis, risk the everything against the 6. He had done the math. He had let the math be done. 6 men going up the cliff face, and he had not moved. This was what leadership looked like sometimes. Not the heroic version, not the version the stories preferred to tell, but the actual operational version, the person who held the full picture when everyone around them could only see their own part of it. 6 against everyone. The math was clear. The math was also 6 men. He had known their names since before the war. The ship came through the strait into open water. The crew kept rowing, because rowing was the only language available right now, the only response their bodies knew how to make. Odysseus stood at the bow and let them row, and looked at the water ahead. The island of Helios was visible on the horizon. He remembered what Tiresias had told him. He started talking to the crew. He told them not to land. He stood at the bow, while the island of Thrinacia was still just a shape on the horizon, and he told them everything. Tiresias, in the underworld, the specific prohibition, the cattle of the sun god, Helios, sacred and untouchable, grazing on that island under a sky that belonged to their owner. The consequences if anyone touched them, he told it plainly, without softening it. The crew had earned the full information. After the Sirens and Scylla and Charybdis, after everything before that, he owed them the unvarnished version. He said, "We sail past. We do not land. We do not stop." Eurylochus said the men are exhausted. This was true. He could see it without being told. The channel had taken something out of them that was not purely physical. The particular depletion that came from surviving something at close range that killed people next to you. He said, "We keep going." The crew went quiet in the way that crews went quiet when they were deciding something. Individual thinking happening simultaneously across too many people to hear any single voice. Then Eurylochus spoke for them. He said, "We have rowed through a channel where 6 of us died. We have been on this water since Troy. We are not asking for a celebration. We are asking to sleep on solid ground tonight and leave in the morning. We will not touch the cattle. We swear it." The men swore, every one of them, hands raised, the formal oath of the ancient world. He looked at them. He could see in their faces that they had nothing left for tonight. The specific exhaustion of men who had used up the reserve that living beings kept for emergencies and were running on the thin layer below that. He had pushed crews before. He knew the difference between pushing and breaking. He told them they could land. He made them swear again, individually, each man's name, each man's oath. He made Eurylochus swear last, and looked at him directly while he did it. Eurylochus met his eyes and swore. They pulled the ship up on the beach. The cattle were visible from where they made camp, golden flanks in the last light of the afternoon, moving slowly across the hillside. Helios's cattle had been on this island since before the Greeks had developed a mythology sophisticated enough to explain why the sun needed cattle. And they had been safe the whole time, because everyone who had ever heard the story of what happened to people who touched them had made the same decision Odysseus was trying to make now. He went to sleep that night, convinced the oath would hold. The wind changed. By morning a south wind was blowing that made departure impossible, pinning the ship against the shore, pushing back against any attempt to launch. They waited. A day passed, then another. The stores from Circe's island began to go down. Odysseus went into the interior to pray, to try every available channel of divine communication for something that would resolve this. And he fell asleep while praying. He was asleep for too long. He did not know exactly what happened in the sequence leading up to the moment he came back to camp. He did not know who spoke first or how the conversation moved from the theoretical to the operational. He knew Eurylochus had been involved, that Eurylochus had framed the situation in a particular way. He had told the men they were going to starve waiting for a wind the gods were clearly not going to send, that dying at sea in a storm was a worse death than whatever Helios might do, that the cattle were right there. When Odysseus came back down the hill, he smelled the meat cooking before he reached the camp. He stopped walking. He stood on the hillside and smelled the meat, and heard the men at the fire, and saw the golden hides spread out on the rocks near the water, and understood what had happened with the totality of a man who had been calculating outcomes, whole voyage, and had finally arrived at the one he was most afraid of. He walked into camp. The men looked at him with the faces of people who had done an irreversible thing and knew it. Not defiant, not apologetic in the way that suggested regret. The recognition of a line crossed that could not be uncrossed regardless of what anyone did now. They ate. There was nothing else to do. For 6 days the wind held them there, and for 6 days they ate. And on the 7th day, the south wind broke, and the sky cleared. They launched the ship. They rowed out of the harbor into open water, and Odysseus stood at the bow and looked at the horizon and tried to calculate how much distance they could put between themselves and this island before whatever was coming caught up with them. They did not get far. The sky went black from the west, the specific black of weather that had intention in it, moving toward a particular ship on a particular piece of water rather than moving generally the way weather moved. The sea came up. The wind tore the rigging out first, and then came the lightning. It hit the ship. The mast came down across the stern. The hull opened along the keel. The men went into the water, and the ship went into the water, and everything that had been keeping them above the surface was suddenly the same temperature as the water around them and sinking. Odysseus lashed the mast to the keel with the backstay. A raft of sorts. Something to keep him above rather than below. And he held on. The current took him. It took him back through the night to the channel between Scylla and Charybdis. Because the Mediterranean did that. Brought things back to where they had started, if there was nothing to stop them. And Odysseus arrived at the channel in the early morning lashed to a broken mast, the sole surviving member of a fleet that had left Ithaca with hundreds of men on 12 ships. Charybdis was open when he got there. He grabbed a fig tree growing from the cliff above the whirlpool and held on, his body dangling over the vortex, while the mast and the keel went down with everything else, and the whirlpool went through its cycle and eventually spat the timbers back up. He dropped back down onto the wreckage. He drifted. He did not know how long. The body did things when the alternative was not doing them, that the mind did not have to be involved in. He was on the water, and the current was taking him somewhere, and he was alive in the minimal technical sense, which was enough to keep him holding on. Eventually he arrived at an island. He dragged himself up onto the shore and lay in the sand in the way that a person lay down when the ground beneath them was the most welcome surface they had ever encountered, simply by virtue of being solid and not trying to drown them. He was alone. For the first time since leaving Ithaca, he was completely, entirely alone. No crew, no ships, no one to lead or to lose or to make decisions on behalf of. Just a man on a beach, salt-crusted and exhausted and alive in the way that people were sometimes alive when they could not fully account for why. He lay there and listened to the sound of the island. Birds, wind in the trees above the beach, water that was not trying to kill him. He had left Ithaca with hundreds of men on 12 ships with the wind behind him and the smell of Troy still on his clothes and the reasonable expectation that he would be home in weeks. He was on a beach somewhere in the Mediterranean. Alone. The island had a name he did not know yet. The woman who lived on it had a name too, and the next phase of his disappearance from the world of the living was about to begin in the way that the worst phases always began. Quietly, with nothing to signal that everything was about to change. He closed his eyes on the sand. The sun moved across the sky above him. He slept. Every morning he walked to the same rock. It was at the eastern end of the island, where the land ran out into a point above the water. And, from that point on, a clear day, you could see a long way. Not all the way home, not even close to all the way home, but you could see the line where the sky met the sea. And that line was at least in the direction of home. And that was enough to make the walk worth making. He would sit on the rock and look at the horizon and cry, not the kind of crying that announced itself, not grief performed for an audience, the kind that happened when a man had run out of the resources required not to, which, after everything that had happened, was a reasonable place to have arrived at, quiet and steady, the way water ran, with no particular beginning and no particular end. Calypso watched him from a distance. She had learned, in the time he had been on the island, that interference was not the right response to this particular morning ritual. She had tried it early on, had come to the rock and sat beside him and offered things, comfort, conversation, the attentions of a goddess who found this man genuinely interesting and was not accustomed to not being enough. He had received these things with the politeness of a man who had learned that receiving graciously was sometimes the most honest available response to kindness you did not ask for. And then he had kept looking at the horizon and crying anyway. She let him have the rock in the mornings. Ogygia was beautiful in the way that places were beautiful, when there was no one around to ruin them with use and opinion. Alders and poplars and fragrant cypress growing to the water's edge, grapevines running wild along the cliff faces, 4 springs running clear and close together, the water cold, even in summer, birds everywhere, the kind that existed before human beings had divided the world into useful and ornamental, falcons and owls and long-winged seabirds sitting in the trees, without any apparent reason to be anywhere else. He had been here for 7 years. The first year he had spent a considerable amount of energy looking for ways off the island. Not obviously, not in the manner of a transparent escape attempt, but with the systematic thoroughness of a man who had been finding solutions to enclosed spaces since the Cyclops' cave, and believed the solution was here somewhere if he looked carefully enough. He looked carefully enough. The island had no boats, and no timber suitable for building one quickly, and no other inhabitants who might have resources he could use. There was no way off without Calypso's help. Calypso was not going to help. Not at first. Not for a long time after first. She loved him. This needed to be stated plainly because it was necessary to understand the situation clearly, not in the abstract way that divine beings sometimes loved mortals, from a distance, with the benevolent detachment of something so much larger than the object of its affection that the feeling did not require the other party to reciprocate. She loved him specifically, the particular man who sat on the rock every morning and cried, who argued with her about navigation and found her jars of herbs and medicines interesting and told her things about Troy she had not known. She had watched people she cared about be taken by the gods or the fates or the specific cruelty of the arrangement between gods and mortals. She was not willing to let the sea have this one. She offered him immortality. She offered it the way you offered something you believed in completely, with the clarity of someone who could see no possible argument against it. He could stay on the island. He would not age. He would not get sick. He would not die in any of the ways that men died. He would be here, on this beautiful island, beyond the reach of Troy and Poseidon and the specific cruelty of a universe that had been eating his crew one at a time since he left home. He said no. He said it the way he said things he had thought about carefully, without drama, without the kind of elaborate refusal that suggested the person doing the refusing was still negotiating with themselves. He had had 7 years to think about this offer. He knew his answer. She asked him why. He was not refusing immortality because he was brave or because some heroic instinct demanded it. He was refusing it because of something more specific and more difficult to articulate. He was refusing it because he was Odysseus. Not Odysseus, the title. The king of Ithaca. The man who thought of the horse. Odysseus, the specific person. Assembled from specific experiences in a specific place, with specific people who knew his face and the sound of his voice and the way he thought through problems. A man who had built a bed from a living tree in a bedroom on a rocky island in the Ionian Sea. Immortality would keep him alive. But the life it kept him in was not his life. It was a life in which he was not a husband or a father or a son or a king. A life in which the bed with the olive roots did not exist because he had never been in the room to build it. A life in which Penelope had grown old and died, waiting for someone who was technically still alive on an island at the edge of the world. A life in which Telemachus had become a man without ever knowing what his father's face looked like. You could live forever in a life that was not yours. That was not living. That was a more permanent version of the disappearance he was already doing. He told Calypso some version of this. She listened with the expression of someone who understood an argument completely and found it both reasonable and unbearable at the same time. She was a goddess who had seen what the mortal world did to people she loved, and she was being told he preferred the mortal world anyway. And she could not make herself argue with the reasoning, even though the conclusion was the one she least wanted. She was honest with him about Penelope, in the way that goddesses could be honest about things that mortals often needed to find out, the slow way. Penelope was a mortal woman of mortal age. And the years had passed there the same way. Years passed, everywhere except here. He was going back to someone who was not the same person he had left. He was going back to a home that had changed. He was choosing the diminished version. The time-worn version. The version that came with aging and loss, and a son who was a stranger, and a house full of men who wanted what was his. He said, "I know." She said, "And you still choose it." He said, "I still choose it." On Ithaca. During those 7 years, something had been changing in the house that Penelope was holding. Telemachus was not a boy anymore. He was a young man, dull, with the bone structure and the set of the eyes that made older people who had known Odysseus do a small, involuntary thing when they looked at him. He had grown up in the great hall, with men who wanted what his father had, men who treated him with the specific courtesy that adults extended to young people they did not actually have to take seriously. He had learned everything his mother could teach him, which was considerable, and he had hit the limit of what could be learned from a mother and a household and a memory of a father who had left when he was too young to remember leaving. He needed to go out. Athena came to him in the form of an old family friend and told him that a young man who wanted to be taken seriously should go out into the world and ask questions about his absent father. He told his mother he was going. She worried, which was what mothers did, and she let him go, which was what she had always understood was the other thing mothers had to do. He sailed to Pylos, then to Sparta, where Menelaus and Helen received him with the generosity of people who understood that this young man's situation reflected something about the cost of the war they had started. Menelaus told him his father was alive. He told him Calypso had him, on an island, and the goddess was keeping him, and he could not get away. Telemachus sailed home with that. He sailed home to find out the suitors had learned of his journey and had planned to ambush him on the water. The plan did not succeed. He got through. He arrived back on Ithaca and went to the farm of Eumaeus, his father's most trusted servant, which was where Athena had told him to go. He did not know yet that his father was already there. Back on Ogygia, the gods finally intervened. Hermes came to the island with a message from Zeus. Calypso had to let him go. The time of the island was done. Odysseus had to be released. Calypso received this with the grace of someone who had been expecting it for a while and had decided in advance how she was going to handle it. She went to the rock where he was sitting. She told him he could go. She would show him where the timber was, give him tools, provision him with bread and water and wine and clothes, and she would send him a fair wind to start him on his way. He looked at her. He said, "Swear it." She swore. He spent 4 days cutting timber and lashing the raft together, working with the focused efficiency of a man who had been waiting a long time to have something practical to do. On the 5th day, the raft was done. She provisioned it. She sent the wind. He stood on the raft as it moved away from the island, and he looked back once. She was standing on the shore. He could see her getting smaller, the figure of her at the water's edge, with the stillness of someone who had decided that watching was what they were going to do, instead of all the things they could do. He turned and looked ahead. 17 days he sailed on that raft. On the 18th day, land appeared on the horizon. And on the 18th day, Poseidon, returning from somewhere he had been that had not required him to think about Odysseus for a while, looked down and saw the raft and recognized the man on it. The storm that followed was the kind that the god of the sea produced when he had been patient for a long time and had arrived at the limit of his patience. The raft came apart. He was in the open ocean, alone, with no raft and no land. He survived. He survived because a sea goddess named Ino took pity on him and gave him a veil that kept him above the water. And because he was Odysseus, and surviving things was the one consistent fact of his existence, when everything else was variable, he washed up on the shore of Scheria, the land of the Phaeacians. 2 days later, naked and alone and in worse condition than the word exhausted fully captured, he crawled up the beach until he was far enough from the waterline that the tide would not reach him. Then he lay down in a pile of leaves under 2 olive trees and went to sleep so deeply it was less like sleep and more like the body shutting down every non-essential system to perform emergency maintenance on what remained. Above him, through the leaves, the sky of a place that was not home but was at least land. He had made it this far. In the morning, a girl doing laundry would find him. The girl was named Nausicaa. She was the daughter of the Phaeacian king Alcinous, and she had come to the river mouth at the edge of the beach with her friends and a cart full of laundry, because Athena had put the idea of laundry in her head the night before. For reasons that Nausicaa did not question, because the daughters of kings who lived on islands at the edge of the known world learned early that the line between a good idea and a divine suggestion was not always clearly marked. She did not see him immediately. They spread the laundry on the beach and washed it in the river and laid it out to dry in the sun and then played a ball game on the sand. And a mist throw sent the ball into the water, and the shouting that followed woke Odysseus from the pile of leaves. He came out of the underbrush, looking the way a man looked after 17 days on a raft and 2 days in the sea and a night in a pile of leaves. The girls scattered in every direction. Nausicaa did not run. He understood immediately that this was important. The girl standing her ground while her companions ran was information about her character that he needed to process quickly and correctly. He could not have looked like anything other than a threat in that first moment. She was afraid. He could see that she was afraid. She stood her ground anyway. He kept his distance. He kept his hands visible. He spoke to her carefully, in the specific mode of address that Odysseus had used many times in his life and had gotten very good at. The mode that said, "I need you not to be afraid of me." He told her she was the most impressive person he had seen since he had last seen the island of Delos, which was a compliment with geography in it, the kind that told the recipient they were being seen clearly rather than flattered in the abstract. Nausicaa listened. She told her companions to come back. She gave him clothes and food and pointed him toward the city. She told him to go to the palace and find the queen, her mother Arete, before he found the king. She told him this with the directness of a girl who understood the structure of her parents' marriage and was giving him tactically useful information because she had decided, in the 30 seconds since he had emerged from the underbrush, that he was worth helping. He followed her directions to the palace. Unmistakable, built by people who did not lack for anything and had decided that beauty was a reasonable use of what they had. Bronze walls, golden doors, silver doorposts. The Phaeacians were maritime traders who had been doing it long enough and well enough that the results were visible in the quality of every surface. He walked in and found the queen. He went to Arete first, as Nausicaa had instructed, and put his hands on her knees in the gesture of supplication that the ancient world used when you needed someone to help you and needed them to understand you were asking. He asked for passage home. Then he sat down in the ashes by the fire. There was a silence in the hall of the kind that followed an unusual event. People recalibrating. A ragged man had walked into their palace, bypassed the protocols of introduction, and gone directly to the queen. The oldest of the king's advisors spoke. He said something to the effect that a guest had arrived and was sitting in the ashes, which was a hint in the direction of hospitality. And Alcinous took the hint. He raised Odysseus from the ashes. He fed him. He asked who he was. Odysseus said he would tell them tomorrow. Tonight he was too tired to be a story. He ate and slept. In the morning the Phaeacians held games in his honor because that was what they did for guests. And Odysseus sat and watched and declined to participate until one of the young men said something about him that was the specific kind of wrong designed to produce a response. Odysseus stood up and threw a discus, farther than anyone there had thrown anything, and then sat back down with the expression of a man who had made a point and considered it made. Alcinous was watching all of this with the attention of a king who had not become king by failing to observe what was in front of him. A guest who had declined to give a name, who had sat in his ashes and asked to go home, who had then thrown a discus farther than any Phaeacian had thrown it and sat back down without comment. He arranged a feast. At the feast, he had his singer perform. The singer was a blind man named Demodocus. Blind singers in the ancient world were understood to have access to information that sighted people did not. A kind of compensation. The eye turned inward and tuned to something beyond the visible surface of things. Demodocus sang about Troy. He sang about the wooden horse. He sang about the man who had thought of it. The king of Ithaca, who had spent 10 years finding solutions that everyone else said were impossible. He sang about it accurately. Odysseus pulled his cloak up over his face. He had been listening to the story of Troy since Troy had been telling parts of it himself when it was useful. He had heard his own name in other people's mouths, in the way that famous names circulated through the world, detached from the people they belonged to. He had never heard the whole thing sung by someone who had not been there and had gotten it right. Demodocus sang about the wooden horse, and Odysseus could smell the inside of it. The specific smell of 20 men in an enclosed space for longer than was comfortable. The pitch and the fur and the sweat and the controlled breathing of men who knew that the sound of breathing was the sound of being found out. He could feel the particular quality of the waiting, the vibration of the Trojans, dragging them up the hill through the gates, the different vibration of the dragging, stopping, the city sounds outside, the celebration sounds, then the silence, then the decision to open the trapdoor. He was crying before he knew he was crying. He pulled the cloak up before anyone could see his face. He was not fast enough. Alcinous was watching. The king stopped the song. He said, "There is a man at this feast who weeps when the story of Troy is sung. He would like to know who that man is." The hall went quiet. Odysseus lowered the cloak from his face. He looked at Alcinous and at Arete and at the assembled Phaeacians and at the blind singer who had his face turned in Odysseus's direction with the attention of someone who did not need to see to know where the significant thing in a room was located. He said, "I am Odysseus, son of Laert, from Ithaca." The hall stayed quiet for a different reason now. He had said the name. The name Demodocus had been singing about. The name attached to the horse and the war and the 10-year siege and all the stories circulating through the Greek world since the fleet left Troy. The name that Polyphemus had thrown into the sea as a curse. The name Poseidon had attached his patience to. He was sitting in their hall in borrowed clothes, thin from the raft and the ocean, looking like what happened after, The story kept going, beyond the part the story stopped at. Alcinous said, "Tell us." Odysseus looked at him. He understood what was being asked and what was being offered. The Phaeacians had ships. Alcinous had already said, before the name came out, that whoever this guest was would be given passage home as a matter of Phaeacian honor. The passage was already promised, but Alcinous was asking anyway. He wanted to understand the distance between the song and the tears. He wanted to know what the story felt like from the inside. Odysseus had told the story before. He had told pieces of it at Circe's island, pieces of it in the underworld when the dead asked how he had gotten there, pieces of it to the crew when they needed to know what was coming next. He had told it functionally, as a tool, the information required to move to the next situation. He had never told it to someone who wanted to understand. He started with Ismera. He talked until the lamps burned low, and then talked while they were replaced, and talked while the Phaeacians refilled their cups and forgot to drink from them. He told it the way a man told something when he was telling it for the last time before putting it down, with the completeness of someone who understood that this audience, in this hall, on this night, was the moment to say all of it. He told them about the cave, about the name he had used and the name he had shouted, and why he had shouted it. He told them about the bag of winds and falling asleep and seeing Ithaca on the horizon and waking to find it gone. He told them about 11 ships in a harbor with cliffs and about cutting the rope and rowing away. He told them about the dead, about his mother, about 3 times reaching for her and 3 times his hands closing on air. He told them about the channel and the choice he had made there, the 6 men he had counted against the everyone, the specific faces he had watched go up the cliff. He said their names out loud in the hall of Alcinous, the names of 6 men who had not been named in any story that would ever be sung, men not famous enough to be remembered by anyone except the man who had commanded the ship they had died on and had done the math that determined they would. He told them about Calypso, about the rock he sat on in the mornings and why, about refusing immortality in the way of someone still slightly surprised by his own decision, who held it up to the light periodically to verify it was right and kept arriving at the same answer. He stopped when the story arrived at the beach where Nausicaa had found him, because that was where the story and the room reconnected and the telling could stop. Alcinous looked at him for a long time. Then he looked at the assembled Phaeacians and said, "This man is going home. Tomorrow, in the best ships we have, with the best crew, and whatever he needs." In the morning they loaded the ship. Odysseus stood on the Phaeacian dock and watched the provisions being carried aboard. The bronze and the gold and the fine clothing, more than he had lost at Troy and on the water combined. Alcinous came to see him off. They stood on the dock together for a moment without speaking. The king of a people who had everything, and the king of an island who had arrived with nothing. And what passed between them was the thing that sometimes passed between people after a long night of true telling. Then Odysseus got on the ship. The Phaeacian crew knew these waters the way birds knew the air. The ship moved with a speed beyond the natural, the combination of divine favor and Phaeacian seamanship. And the night came down, and the stars came out, and Odysseus lay down in the stern and closed his eyes. He was asleep before they cleared the harbor. He was so deeply asleep that he did not feel the ship arrive. He did not feel the Phaeacians carry him ashore. He did not feel them set him down on the beach with the treasure stacked carefully around him. He woke alone on a beach in a mist. He sat up. He looked at the treasure around him. Then he looked at the mist and understood before it cleared that the mist had been put there deliberately. And when it did clear, he saw an olive grove and a harbor and a hill above the harbor whose shape he knew the way he knew a face he had been looking at his whole life. He was on Ithaca. He put his face in his hands and sat there for a moment, alone, with the treasure around him and the olive grove above him and the island he had been trying to get back to for 10 years finally. Actually, under him. He was home. He was also. He understood After a moment, very far from done, Athena appeared and told him what she told him, in the plain, direct way of gods who had decided to be direct. There were men in his house. His wife was holding them off by a thread. His son was somewhere on the island and needed to be found. The situation required handling carefully. She touched him, and he aged. The real aging of time. Made visible. Skin thickening. Hair going grey. Posture acquiring the compression of years. She gave him rags to wear over it. He looked like an old beggar. He looked like no one. He picked up a walking stick. He walked up the hill toward the house he had built and been away from for 20 years. In the body of a man that nobody who had known him would recognize. Carrying nothing except the complete knowledge of what he was walking into and a plan he was still working on. He was, for the second time in his life, nobody. This time the name fit differently. 20 years is a long time to hold a house. Not hold it the way you held a position in a battle, with weapons and the visible fact of force. Hold it the way water held a shape, by filling every available space, by being present in every corner, by making the alternative to your presence unthinkable, even to the people who would prefer you gone. Penelope had been doing this since the ships left for Troy. The suitors had started arriving in the 3rd year. Not all at once. A few at first. Men from the neighboring islands and the mainland who had heard that the king of Ithaca had not come home yet, and that the queen was alone. They came to court her, which was the word the situation used for what was actually a slow-motion occupation of her house. They ate her food. They drank her wine. They slept in her guest rooms, and then stopped thinking of themselves as guests and started thinking of themselves as contestants in a competition that would eventually produce a winner. The resources of Ithaca kept being directed toward feeding them, and no one with the authority to stop this was present to stop it. By the time there were more than 100 of them, the house had changed character in the way that spaces changed when the people in them changed. The great hall that Odysseus had built was loud in the evenings, with men who had stopped being on their best behavior because there was no one present who required it. Telemachus was in the house with them. He had grown up in this hall while these men occupied it, which meant he had grown up in the condition of being the son of a famous, absent father in a room full of men who wanted what his father had. He was not a child anymore. He was 20 years old, with his father's face, in the way that sons sometimes had their father's face, the bone structure and the set of the eyes that made older people who had known Odysseus do a small, involuntary thing when they looked at him. He could not make the suitors leave. He did not have the authority or the men or the resources to force the issue. And they all knew it. And they treated him with the specific courtesy that adults extended to young people they did not actually have to take seriously. Penelope moved through all of this. She received the suitors formally, one at a time, in the correct manner, with the correct words, in the way a queen received people who technically had a claim on her attention, even when that claim was a situation she did not choose. She was never rude. She was never warm. She gave them the precise minimum of what hospitality required, and not one word or gesture more. And she did it so consistently that the more observant of the suitors had started to understand that they were not gaining ground, that the courtesy they were receiving was not a softening, but a wall maintained at exactly the height required to keep them from doing anything that would force a direct confrontation. She had the loom and the shroud she was weaving on it, the burial shroud for Laertes, Odysseus's father, the old man on the farm who was still alive but would not be alive forever, and for whom she had announced with the gravity appropriate to such announcements. She needed to complete a proper burial shroud before she could in good conscience think about remarrying. This had bought her 3 years. She wove during the day, making visible progress, the fabric growing the way fabric grew when someone worked at it steadily. The suitors who came to observe saw exactly what they needed to see, evidence that the task was being taken seriously and was proceeding toward completion. At night, by lamplight, she took it apart, thread by thread, row by row, working backward through the day's work with the patience of someone who had found the one controllable variable in an uncontrollable situation and had decided to control it absolutely. She unraveled everything she wove, and in the morning started again from where she had been the morning before. And the shroud stayed the same size. It had been the day Laertes had not died. A man inconsiderately continuing to be alive, while his daughter-in-law used his theoretical death as structural support. It was one of her maidservants who eventually told the suitors what was happening at night. The maidservant was not a villain. She was a woman in a difficult position who made a decision that seemed to offer advantages and turned out not to. The suitors confronted Penelope, and the loom trick was over. And she had to finish the shroud on an actual timeline. She invented new tactics. This was the thing about Penelope, that the story sometimes undersold by focusing on the waiting. By making the waiting the main fact about her rather than the activity she conducted inside it. She was not passive. She was operating inside severe constraints. The constraints of a world where a woman alone in a house full of men who wanted something from her had a very limited set of tools. And she was using every one of those tools with the precision of someone who had spent 20 years getting very good at working within narrow limits. She managed information. She knew things about the suitors' situations and relationships and rivalries that they did not know she knew. And she used that knowledge to keep them from forming the unified front that would have made her position untenable. She kept them competing with each other. She made the competition feel real enough that the competitors kept competing rather than collaborating. She managed Telemachus, not in the way of manipulation, but in the way of a mother who was also the chief administrator of a political crisis and who needed her son to develop the judgment and the bearing of his father without the benefit of his father being present to demonstrate what those things looked like. She told him things about Odysseus, not the heroic version, not the Trojan horse and the Cyclops, but the small things, the way he thought about problems, the way he made decisions, the way he sat at a table with difficult people and did not show them what he was calculating. She told Telemachus these things so he would know who he was the son of. In the practical sense, the sense that would be useful when he needed to be useful, she also told him to go. She told him this because she knew that staying in the house was making him into something smaller than what he needed to become. The presence of the suitors and the absence of his father was shaping him into a man who had learned to manage humiliation rather than refuse it. He went. He came back with the news that his father was alive, kept on an island by a goddess, and could not get away. He came back to find out the suitors had planned to ambush him on the water. The plan did not succeed. He got through. He arrived back on Ithaca and went to the farm of Eumaeus, which was where Athena had told him to go. He walked in and found an old beggar sitting by the fire. He treated the old beggar with the courtesy his mother had taught him to extend to guests, because she had understood, in the way of someone who had been living on the goodwill of hospitality law for 20 years, that how you treated strangers was information about who you were. Odysseus looked at his son. He had last seen this person when this person was an infant in the path of a plow on a morning he had been trying to avoid. He was looking at a man who moved the way he himself moved, who sat at the table the way he himself sat, who listened before he spoke, in the way that was not learned but somehow transmitted through the specific mystery of how people became their parents without meaning to. He looked at his son for a long time. Then Athena came to him while Telemachus was outside and told him it was time. She touched him, and he was himself again. Briefly, the real face under the disguise. And he walked back into the room. Telemachus looked up and saw a different man than had been there a moment before. He thought it was a god. He said so, in the anxious way of a young man who had grown up in a world where gods appeared in human form regularly. Odysseus said, "I am not a god. I am your father." Telemachus stared at him, He said, "You cannot be my father. My father is Odysseus. He has been gone for 20 years. Odysseus said, "I have been gone for 20 years. That is exactly what I am telling you." A silence. Then Telemachus crossed the room, and they held each other the way people held each other when the thing they had stopped letting themselves hope for had happened. Completely. Without the restraint that otherwise governed how men in that world touched each other. They held on and they cried. And this time Odysseus let himself cry without calculating anything. Because there was nothing to calculate in this moment. Because this was what the whole impossible voyage had been aimed at, without his being able to see it clearly enough to aim. Odysseus pulled back first. He wiped his face. He looked at his son. He said, "Tell me everything about the house." Telemachus told him. 108 suitors, armed, in the great hall every day. The weapons had to be moved from the hall before anything else happened. Telemachus would do it. He would say the smoke from the fires was tarnishing the bronze. He told Telemachus what was going to happen next. He was going to go back into the house as the beggar, no matter what happened, no matter what he saw. Telemachus was not to react, not to the insults, not to whatever the suitors said or did to the old man in the corner, not until the time came. When the time came, Odysseus told him. He would know. Telemachus nodded. He was 20 years old, and his father had just walked back into his life after an absence that had shaped every single day of it. And his father was already planning the next move. He recognized this. He had heard about it his whole life. He nodded and asked one question. He said, "Do you actually have a plan? Or are you building it as you go?" Odysseus looked at him for a moment. He said, "Both. It is always both." He walked back into his own house as a stranger. The disguise was good. Athena had altered not just the face, but the way he moved and held himself in occupied space. All the things that were as identifying as any feature. He walked with the forward lean of a man who had been carrying weight for longer than he remembered. The careful step of someone whose body had become something to be managed rather than trusted. He wore rags. He carried a bag. He walked through the courtyard gate, and the first thing he saw was the dog. Argus. He was lying on a pile of dung near the stable doors. An old dog, in the condition of old dogs, who had been left without their person, who had aged past usefulness into a state of simply existing, maintained out of some obligation no one had gotten around to formally cancelling. His coat was matted. His bones showed. He was lying with his head on the ground in the way of animals who no longer saw a reason to hold it up. Odysseus walked past him. He had to. He could not stop. He could not crouch down and put his hands on the dog the way he had put his hands on him in those early years on the island, when Argos was young and fast and followed him everywhere with the single-minded attachment that young dogs developed for the person who was the center of their world. He could not do any of that because people were watching, and the plan required that no one know who the beggar was. He kept walking, 2 steps past the dog. Argos raised his head. The old dog lifted his head from the ground, and his ears moved, and his tail moved. Once, the tail movement of an animal making the largest motion it could still make, doing the thing it knew how to do with the resources still available to it. Argos recognized him, not the disguise, not the old man's face or the ragged clothes or the walking stick. Whatever the dog was reading was underneath all of that. Something in the movement, or the smell, or the specific quality of presence that the goddess had altered the surface of, but had not reached all the way down to. The dog knew him. Odysseus kept walking. He walked through the door of his house and did not look back. And the story did not record what his face was doing in those seconds, because there was no one in a position to see it clearly. Behind him, Argos put his head back down. He died there, in the dung heap, in the way of animals who had been waiting for a specific thing and had received confirmation that the thing they were waiting for had arrived, and had then been released from the waiting, inside the hall. The suitors were doing what the suitors did in the evenings, eating and drinking and arguing and occupying the space the way that men occupied a space when they had decided it belonged to them. Loud, loose, with the comfort of people who had stopped being on their best behavior. Odysseus moved through them, as a beggar moved, asking for scraps from each man in turn, the way Athena had instructed him and the way he had observed beggars operate on his way to the house. He was watching everything, doing the inventory he had started at Eumaeus's farm and was now completing at close range, counting the men, assessing their positions, noticing the weapons on the walls that Telemachus had not yet moved, looking at the doors and the windows and the geometry of the room. Some of the suitors gave him food. One of them threw a footstool at him. The footstool hit him in the shoulder. He absorbed the impact without moving from where he was standing, without changing his expression, without giving any indication that the man who had just thrown furniture at him was anything other than a member of the public whose behavior was not his business. He reached down and picked up what had fallen from the footstool's impact and continued his circuit of the hall. Telemachus, sitting near the door, saw this happen. His hands went still on the table. His face did the thing his father had told him his face could not do, the thing where the anger showed. And then he looked at his father, and his father was not looking at him, but the quality of his father's not looking was itself an instruction. And Telemachus looked back at his drink and breathed. There was a real beggar in the hall. This produced the most purely absurd episode of the evening, which was a fist fight between Odysseus and the resident beggar, a large, soft man named Iris, who had established himself as the hall's beggar on the basis of being there first and was not pleased about competition. The suitors organized it as a sporting event, placing bets and clearing a space in the middle of the hall. Odysseus considered the situation carefully. He needed to win, because a beggar who lost fights was treated differently than a beggar who won them. He needed to not win in a way that revealed who he was, because the man inside the rags had spent 10 years in a war and had the body that produced. He calibrated the performance with care, winning quickly and cleanly and without demonstration, sitting back down before the suitors could process what they had just seen. The suitors applauded and went back to their drinks. He sat in the corner and watched. Penelope sent for him. A servant came late in the evening and said the queen wished to speak with the stranger, that she had heard there was a traveller in the hall who had news from the wider world, and that she wished to ask him about her husband. He went to her rooms. She was waiting in the way that Penelope waited for things, with the stillness of someone who had learned that the waiting was part of the work. She looked at the old man who came into her room, and she asked him who he was and where he came from and what he had heard about Odysseus. He told her a story. The story was built around true things, arranged to produce the effect he needed. He told her he had hosted Odysseus once, years ago, described details of the encounter that someone who had been there would know. He described a brooch that Odysseus had worn, a specific golden brooch, a brooch that she had given him herself. She looked at him while he talked. He could not read her face. This was unusual. He could read most faces. He had been reading faces for 20 years because that was one of the primary survival skills available to a man in his situation. Penelope's face gave him nothing. She listened with the expression of someone doing interior work that had no visible surface. She said, "If what you are telling me is true, then he will be home soon." He said, "He will be home before the new moon." A silence. She said, "I hope you are right. I do not hope things lightly anymore." She told him about the suitors. She told him the way of someone who has not had anyone worth telling for a long time, with the specific detail that came from having had the information and no recipient for it. Then she said, "I am going to hold a contest. The bow of Odysseus, the one he left behind when he went to Troy. Whoever can string it and shoot an arrow through 12 axe heads in a row will have me." He said, "That is a good plan." She looked at him for a moment longer. She said, "Yes, I thought so too." He went back to the hall and slept on the floor near the door. a pile of ox hides, and a fleece. And he lay there and looked at the ceiling of his own hall and listened to the sounds of the house at night. The wood settling, the fire dying, the wind off the water moving through the gaps in the shutters. He knew every one of those sounds. In the morning the axes would be set up in the hall. He lay on the floor of his hall and worked the plan through its final iterations, making adjustments, arriving at the same place every time. The plan required things to happen in a particular order, and nobody to do anything outside the order until the order was complete. He was almost certain Telemachus could hold to that. Outside, the island was quiet in the way. It was quiet before dawn, with the birds not yet started, and the water not yet catching light. The few minutes every morning when Ithaca was just itself. The rock and the trees and the particular smell of the Ionian Sea in the early hours. The smell he had been unable to recreate in his memory, no matter how hard he tried. The smell that was here and only here, and that he had been breathing for the last few days without letting himself register it too directly, because registering it too directly was not compatible with the plan. He registered it now. He lay on the floor of his hall and breathed the air of his island and waited for the light to come. In the morning, Telemachus moved the weapons. He went through the hall, while the suitors were still sleeping off the previous night, and took the spears and the swords and the shields from the walls and the corners, everything within reach of a man who might decide to reach for something, and carried them to the storeroom at the back of the house. He did it methodically, without hurry, because hurry attracted attention, and what he needed was for this to look like household maintenance. One of the suitors woke up and asked what he was doing. Telemachus said the smoke from the fire was tarnishing the bronze. The suitor looked at him for a moment and went back to sleep. When it was done, when the hall had been cleared of everything that could be picked up quickly by a man who decided the situation required it, Telemachus found his father. Odysseus was already awake. He had not slept much. He had lain on the ox hides and run the same sequence of events through the same mental simulation repeatedly, adjusting variables, looking for the places where things broke down, patching the breaks, running it again. By the time the hall began to lighten, with the early morning coming through the shutters, he had run it enough times that he was as confident as he was going to get, which was not fully confident, because full confidence was not available for plans that involved one man and his son against 108 armed men in an enclosed space. It was available in the form of, "This is the best plan there is, given what there is to work with." He told Telemachus, "Stay at your seat. When it starts, get to the storeroom and arm yourself. Come back fast." Telemachus said he understood. Odysseus said, "And if I tell you to do something during it, do it without asking why." Telemachus said, "I know." Odysseus looked at him. He said, "You do know. That is the thing about you." Telemachus did not know what to do with that. Fathers who had been gone for 20 years did not say things like that to sons who had grown up without them. Not in any experience Telemachus had to draw on. What he landed on was to nod once and go back to his seat in the hall, which was exactly the right response, and also the response of a man who understood he could not afford to be moved by things right now, because being moved by things was the enemy of the work that needed to happen. The suitors came in for the morning meal. Penelope came down later. She came in with the bow. It had been in the storeroom since before the war, hung on a peg in the back of the room since the morning Odysseus left it there when he sailed. The string had been taken off and stored separately, the way you stored a bow when you were not using it for an extended period, to keep the tension off the wood. It was not a small bow. It required a combination of strength and technique and the physical intelligence of someone who had been using that bow for years and had learned its specific requirements. She carried it into the hall herself. She stood in front of the assembled suitors and told them the terms. Whoever could string the bow and send an arrow through the iron rings of 12 axes set in a line would have her hand and the household of Odysseus and Ithaca with it. She said this the way she said most things, clearly and without excess. And then she sat in her chair by the door and waited. The axes went into the floor in a line. Telemachus dug the trench for them himself, using his father's carpenter's rule to keep them straight, getting them right on the first attempt, which was information about how carefully he had listened to things he had been told about his father. He tried to string the bow first, 3 times, close on the 3rd try. Close enough that the suitors watching understood this was not a man who could not do the thing, but a man who had decided to stop at exactly the point where stopping was appropriate. Telemachus put the bow down and stepped back with the expression of someone who had correctly performed exactly what was needed. He sat down. The suitors went one at a time. The first few were confident. They had the confidence of men who had spent years in a hall, convincing themselves and each other that they were the most capable men available for the position they were competing for. And they went at the bow with the certainty of that conviction. The bow did not respond to certainty. It sat in their hands and refused to become what it needed to become. The physics of the thing declining to cooperate. The next ones tried harder. Some of them warmed the bow first, holding it near the fire to soften the wood, which was a thing you did with difficult bows, and was also a visible admission that the direct approach had not worked. It did not work warmed either. They went through a third of the room. The mood changed. Confidence became something that needed to be maintained against the evidence accumulating with each man who tried and put the bow down. The loud ones got louder. The way groups got louder when the thing that was supposed to happen was not happening. Odysseus had been watching from his place near the door. He stood up and asked if he could try. The hall turned toward him. A silence, and then a noise. Not quite laughter, but what laughter grew from, when the material was the right kind of absurd. An old beggar asking to try the bow of Odysseus after 108 men in the prime of their lives had failed to string it. Some of them said things. Most said the same thing with different words, which was that this was not a situation where the beggar's participation was welcome. Telemachus said, "Give him the bow." The room looked at Telemachus. He met the room with the face of a man who had decided something and was not going to undecide it because of how many people were looking at him. He said it again. He said, "Give the stranger the bow. If he cannot string it, we lose nothing. Give him the bow." There was pushback. The pushback of a large group of men who had been dominating a space for years and were now confronted with a young man who had decided to stop being dominated. The pushback of people who had learned to expect compliance and were encountering something that was not compliance and had not yet finished processing what that meant. A servant brought the bow to Odysseus. He took it. He sat down with it in his lap and turned it over in his hands, with the slowness of a man examining something he had not seen in a long time, checking for cracks in the wood, checking the tips where the string would go, the way a craftsman examined a tool he had set aside and was picking up again. The hall watched, the old man sitting with the bow in his lap, turning it over, looking at it. He strung it. He did it without apparent effort, without the struggle that had defined every previous attempt, without preparation or warming or multiple tries. He picked up the string and bent the bow, and the string went on. It took the amount of time it took to do something you had done many times before, which was to say almost no time at all. The hall was completely quiet. He tested the string with a pluck of his fingers. The bow sang, a clean single note that went through the room and through the suitors and through the silence, in a way the room held for a moment after the note itself had stopped. Then he took an arrow. He sat where he was, on the floor, near the door, and he drew and he shot, and the arrow went through all 12 rings cleanly. The way arrows went through targets when the person shooting them had not forgotten how. He set the bow across his knees. He looked at Telemachus. Telemachus looked at his father, and his father's face was his father's face. The disguise gone or no longer relevant. The real face present and making a decision visible in it that Telemachus had been told to wait for. Telemachus went to the storeroom. Odysseus stood up. From the beggar's bag he took an arrow. not the competition arrow, the kind with a specific purpose. He looked at the man who had thrown the footstool at him the first night. He put the arrow through his throat. The hall understood what was happening at approximately the same moment, which meant the hall moved at approximately the same moment. The 100 and some men who were not Telemachus, and not Eumaeus, and not the herdsman who had come in at the back, all of them moving toward the walls where the weapons had been, and finding bare walls. The doors were closed. Telemachus was back from the storeroom with spears. What followed was not a battle in the sense of two forces meeting on equal terms. It was what happened when preparation met surprise in a closed room, when the people who had been planning knew where everything was, and the people who had not been planning had just found out there was nothing on the walls. Loud and close, and it lasted the amount of time it took for the arithmetic to resolve itself. One suitor got to the storeroom. He brought back a dozen sets of armor and distributed them to 11 other men, and those 12 were the ones who required the most time. The ones who had found their footing and their weapons and were trying to turn the space back into something workable. Odysseus kept shooting. Telemachus kept fighting. Eumaeus held his door. It ended. The hall was quiet in the way. Enclosed spaces were quiet when the thing happening in them had stopped. The noise was over and the room was itself again. The room Odysseus had built. The hall he had eaten in and argued in and sat in on ordinary evenings before the war had made ordinary evenings theoretical. He stood in the middle of it. He was breathing hard, which was information about being in his 40s after months on a raft and a beach and a ship and the floor of his own hall, rather than in the condition of a 20-year-old who had been training for war his whole life. He was breathing hard and he was standing, and the hall was quiet, and his son was at the door. He looked at the room, 20 years away. Troy, and 12 years of ocean and 7 years on Calypso's island, and a raft and a hall full of men who had been eating his food since before his son could shave. He had come home as a beggar and slept on his own floor and watched a footstool hit him in the shoulder and not moved because the plan required not moving. He was home. The house was his again. He told Telemachus to find the herald and the singer, the men who had not been part of what the suitors were. He told the servants who were loyal to do what needed to be done to make the hall usable again. There was one more thing. After the hall was as quiet as it was going to be, after the practical matters had been attended to, Odysseus stood in the space he had built with his own hands 20 years ago and thought about the women of the household who had been here through the occupation, the ones who had navigated an impossible situation for years with whatever tools they had, and the ones who had not navigated it in the ways that the household now required accounting for. He thought about this for a long time. The ancient world did not make these accounting easy or simple, and the things that happened in the aftermath of the hall that night were the kind of things the ancient world did without blinking, and that a later world would look back on and find difficult to square with the idea of a just homecoming. He stood in the middle of his hall and understood that what he had gotten back was complicated by what it had cost. And that cost was not only paid by the men who had wanted his wife and his kingdom. Some things you carried home with you. Then he told his son to send for Penelope. She did not come immediately. The herald came to her rooms and told her what had happened in the hall, and she sat with that information for a moment. The way she had sat with information her entire adult life, not acting on the first version of it, not being carried by the momentum of what it appeared to be. She came down eventually. She came into the hall and looked at the man standing in the middle of it and sat down across from him, with a reasonable distance between them and with the expression of someone looking at something carefully before deciding what it was. She was not cold. She was not distant in the way of someone withholding warmth. She was paying attention before committing. Telemachus watched from the door. He said to her mother, "There is the man. There is your husband. He has come home. Why are you sitting there and not going to him?" Penelope said, "If it is him, we will know each other. We have ways of knowing each other that other people do not have." Telemachus looked at his father. Odysseus looked at his son and gave a very small movement of his head that Telemachus correctly interpreted as "let her." She asked him questions about his voyage, where he had been and what he had seen, and he answered. And the answers were true and specific, and she listened with the attention of someone building a picture, adding what he said to what she was seeing, cross-referencing the information, the way she cross-referenced everything. After a while she turned to a servant and said, "Take the bed out of the bedroom, the big bed. Bring it out here so our guest has somewhere comfortable to sleep." Odysseus went still. Then he was not still. He said, "What did you say?" She said it again. "The bed. Have it moved out here." He looked at her. He said, "You cannot move that bed." She said nothing. He said, "I built that bed. I built it around the olive tree that was growing in the courtyard, the one with the roots that went down through the floor into the rock. I fitted the frame to the trunk. I made the headboard and the posts from the branches of that tree. No one can move that bed without cutting through the root. The root is in the earth. The earth is in the rock. You cannot move it. You know you cannot move it, unless someone cut the root. Did someone cut the root?" The last question came out in a different tone than the rest of it. A tone she recognized. A tone she had not heard in 20 years, but had heard enough before 20 years ago that her body recognized it before her mind finished processing it. She crossed the room. She was crying before she reached him. The way people cried when the thing they had been holding themselves away from was suddenly right in front of them, and the distance was no longer necessary or possible. She put her arms around him, and he put his arms around her, and this time his arms did not go through anything. She said, "Do not be angry. You were always the most careful person I knew. I had to be sure." He said, "I know." She said, "I have been waiting." He said, "I know. I know you have." She said, 20 years is a long time to hold a house." He said, "It is." "You held it." She pulled back enough to look at his face. The face under the 20 years, and the voyage, and the war. The face she had last seen on the morning he sailed, and had been reconstructing in her memory ever since. She said, "I kept looking at Telemachus and seeing you." He said, "I know. I saw it too." She held his face in her hands the way people held things they had been afraid they would never hold again, and were recalibrating around the fact of having them back. They sat down. He told her things he had not told the Phaeacians and had not told Telemachus. The things that had no function as information, that were not useful in the operational sense, that had no audience they were suited to, except this one. He told her about the rock on Calypso's island, where he sat every morning. He told her about his mother in the underworld and the 3 times he had reached for her. He told her about the night in the horse, the specific smell of the inside of it, the sound of the Trojans dragging it through the gates. The moment he had made the decision to open the trap door, she listened. She told him things too. She told him about the weaving, not the strategy of it, but the actual experience of it. Sitting at the loom at night, taking apart the work of the day, the particular quality of that silence, the way time moved differently when you were doing something that erased itself. She told him about the night she had heard the suitors planning to ambush Telemachus at sea, the terror of knowing your child was in danger on the water and being on land with no way to reach them. She told him she had dreamed about him. He asked her what he had been doing in the dream. She said, "Coming home. Always the same dream. You were coming home, but something kept being wrong. The island looked different, or the harbor was wrong, or I could see you on the ship, but the ship would not come in. I had that dream for years." He said, "I had a version of that dream too." She said, "What happened in yours?" He said, "I would get to the gate, and I could not make myself walk through." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "Why not?" He thought about this. He said, "I think I was afraid of who I had become. I was afraid you would look at me and see what the war and the ocean had made, instead of the person who left." She looked at him. She said, "I see the person who left." He said, "He is still in here somewhere." She said, "I know. I can see where he is." He reached for her hand. They sat in the room he had built, with the bed that was also a tree in the room behind them. while the house settled into the quiet of a place that had gone through something large and was now resting. Outside, the island was dark. The harbour was quiet. The goats were on the hillsides. The olive trees on the slopes above the house were the same olive trees that had been there when he left, 20 years older, in the way that olive trees aged, which was slowly, almost imperceptibly, so that the tree you looked at today was almost indistinguishable from the tree you had looked at 2 decades before. He was home, not the idea of it, not the direction of it, the actual thing, the rock and the salt air, and the woman beside him, and the tree in the bedroom, and the son at the door, who had his face. They went to bed. The bed was where it had always been, in the room he had built around the tree, the olive trunk rising from the floor in the corner, the roots below it in the rock of the island, unchanged. The one thing in his life that was exactly where he had left it. He lay in it for the first time in 20 years. He lay there and felt the particular quality of it, the way it felt like itself and nothing else, the way there was no other surface in the world with exactly this combination of the mattress and the wood and the faint smell of the tree and the sound of the island at night coming through the window. He had been on Calypso's island for 7 years and slept in her bed, and it had been a perfectly good bed, and it had never felt like this. He was asleep before Penelope. She lay beside him and listened to him breathe, and looked at the ceiling of the room she had been sleeping in alone for 20 years. The same ceiling. And she thought about the dream, the one where he was coming home but something kept being wrong. She thought about all the versions she had dreamed of this moment over 20 years. All the ways she had rehearsed the return in sleep when it was not available in waking. The harbour was right tonight. The island looked right. The ship had come in. She closed her eyes. They slept. In the morning there would be the rest of it. The families of the men who had died in the hall. A kingdom that had been neglected. A son to know. Things you could not undo about 20 years. You did not come home and become the person you had been before you left. You came home, and you were who you had become. And you started from there. He was asleep, outside, through the window. The Ionian Sea moved in the dark, the way it moved every night. Doing the thing it did regardless of what human beings were doing on the land it surrounded. The olive tree grew in the corner of the room. The roots went down through the floor into the rock. The rock was the island. The island was home. Homer's poem does not end with the bed. This is worth knowing. Not because it changes what the bed meant, but because the world that Odysseus came back to was not a world that rearranged itself neatly around his return. The dead did not stay quiet. The living did not accept outcomes simply because the outcomes had occurred. Ithaca, which had been a house occupied by men who had families and fathers and brothers on the neighboring islands. He was now a house where those men were dead, and the families were waking up to that fact in the morning light. By the time Odysseus found his father, the situation had already started. He went to Laertes' farm on the morning after the haul, while the island was still absorbing what had happened, while the news was still moving from the harbour to the farms and the farms to the outlying settlements, in the way that news moved on a small island, faster than anyone expected, and with more distortion than anyone intended. The farm was small. Laertes had retreated to it sometime in the years of the absence, withdrawing from the palace and the town into the particular solitude of a man who had decided that the world he understood no longer existed, and who had found a piece of ground where that fact was easier to live with. He was working in the garden when Odysseus arrived, an old man in a worn tunic, his hands in the dirt around the base of a pear tree, doing the patient, tending work of someone who had found that plants asked nothing of you except what you gave them. He did not hear Odysseus coming. Odysseus stood at the edge of the garden and looked at his father's back and understood something about time that he had understood abstractly for 20 years and now understood in the specific, irreversible way of something seen directly. His father was old, not the old of the man who had been king when Odysseus left. still straight-backed and capable, old in the way of a man who had stopped fighting the weight of years and had let them settle where they settled. He had been waiting too. Odysseus walked into the garden. Laertes heard the footstep and turned, and he looked at the man coming toward him, the way old men looked at strangers, with the careful attention of someone whose eyes had gotten less reliable and who had learned to compensate by looking longer before committing to what he was seeing. He looked at Odysseus for a long time. Odysseus said nothing. He let his father look. He watched the moment happen in his father's face. The slow assembly of recognition from parts that had been stored separately and were now being retrieved and fitted together. The line of the jaw and the set of the shoulders, and the way the son stood in the garden, and the way the father had stood in the garden when the father was younger and the son was not yet born. Laertes said his name. He said it quietly, the way people said the name of something they had not allowed themselves to say for a long time. Carefully, as if the saying of it might undo the thing they were looking at. Odysseus crossed the garden and put his arms around his father. His father was smaller than he remembered. That was the specific physical fact of it, the thing the body registered before anything else. The man who had seemed large in the way that fathers seemed large was now the size of an old man who had been tending a garden alone for too many years. He held him anyway. They stood in the garden with the pear trees around them and the morning coming through the leaves. Two men, separated by 20 years and a war and an ocean and the specific cruelty of not knowing, now in the same place, at the same time, which was the only requirement for the holding and the one requirement that had not been met for 2 decades. It was not a resolution. That was the honest thing to say about it. It was not the undoing of 20 years. It was not the restoration of the time, or the retrieval of the mornings and evenings and ordinary days that had been spent apart. His mother was dead. The men who had gone to Troy with him and not come home were still not home. The 6 men on Scylla's cliff were still on Scylla's cliff. None of that was changed by the garden or the holding or the recognition in his father's face. What it was a beginning, the specific kind of beginning available on the other side of a very long absence, which was not the same as a fresh start and not the same as a continuation of what was interrupted, but its own thing. The beginning of a life built from what remained after the war, and the ocean had taken what they took. By midday, the families of the dead suitors had gathered outside the farm. They came with weapons and grief and the anger of people who had absorbed bad news and converted it into the forward motion of doing something about it. What they wanted to do something about was the man who had killed their sons and brothers and cousins in a hall that those men had, from the family's perspective, simply been eating in. The confrontation happened in the farm's field, which was not where Odysseus would have chosen to have it, but was where it happened, because the world did not wait for the right venue. There were deaths on both sides before Athena appeared, not in a subtle form this time, not as a shepherd or a family friend, but present in the way that gods were present when they had decided that enough had happened, and what needed to stop now. She stopped it. She told both sides to be done with it. She said it in the voice that divine beings used when they were not asking, and the men in the field heard it with the part of themselves that recognized the difference between a human voice and something else. The weapons went down. The anger did not go away. Anger like that did not go away because a goddess told it to. But it went quiet, which was a different thing and was, for the purposes of that morning in that field, sufficient. The families took their dead and went home. Odysseus stood in the field and watched them go. Ithaca was going to take time, a kingdom without its king for 20 years, occupied and depleted and shaped by the long presence of men who had no intention of maintaining what they found, did not become itself again in a morning. The storerooms were low. The alliances with the other islands needed to be rebuilt from the acknowledgement that they had been neglected. The people who had been loyal through the occupation, and the people who had not needed to find some way to exist in the same community going forward. There was a son who was mostly a stranger. A young man he had produced, and then not been present for, who would need to be known in the way you knew someone, which was slowly, through the accumulation of ordinary time spent in the same place. There was a wife who had held the house and who deserved something more than the return of the person she had been holding it for. She deserved the years that were coming, the ordinary years, the years without monsters in them, the years that did not have Poseidon's name attached to the weather. He was going to stay. He was going to stay on this island and tend to what had been neglected and learn who his son was and sit at dinner with his wife in the evenings, and the dinner was going to be unremarkable and the evening was going to be ordinary, and both of those things were going to be the best things he had experienced since the last time ordinary evenings had existed. He walked back through the farm to where his father was. Laertes was back at the pear tree. He had not gone inside. He had gone back to the work, because the work was there and because some habits were deeper than interruption, deeper than even this interruption. Odysseus went and stood next to him. His father did not look up. He said, "This one needs the soil loosened around the base. The roots get compacted." Odysseus crouched down. He began loosening the soil with his hands. They worked in silence, the two of them, in the garden, with the pear trees around them, and the morning doing what mornings did. After a while his father started talking, not about the absence or the return or anything large, but about the trees, about which ones had been planted when, and which ones were having a good year and which needed attention. Odysseus listened. He listened the way he had listened to everything important in his life, completely, giving it the whole of his attention, not calculating anything, not planning anything, not weighing the information against something else, just listening to his father talk about pear trees in a garden on an island in the Ionian Sea, on a morning that was ordinary in every way, except that it existed, which was the only way a morning needed to be remarkable. The soil came loose around the base of the tree. The roots were there, running out through the garden in every direction, the way roots ran, finding their way through the rock and the soil to wherever the water was, doing the patient, invisible work of keeping the tree upright and fed and alive. He put the soil back. He smoothed it with his hands. He stayed. The olive tree in the bedroom of the house above the harbour had its roots in the same rock as this garden, the same island, the same ground that his father was tending and his son would tend after him. Roots did not move. That was the thing about them. That was the whole thing.